Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Stratagoy video. We're moving on from one type of elf to another. First, Teclis's chosen elves to his kind of thrown away elves that got thrown to the at the bottom of the sea because they had to run away from the genocidal maniac that, from their perspective, Teclis actually is. But anyway, we're moving on to Idoneth today, which is actually kind of momentous for me, at least with the channel. And I think Jonas, you're probably on the same page, right? With that,
Definitely.
this is where it all began with us working together. You want
Yeah.
to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, back then, the first game that we played, you brought your IDK list. I think we did the tournament the day afterwards, or a couple of weeks afterwards. I don't even remember. But I remember after the tournament thinking, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. And I asked you to do the new Idoneth Deepkin book review with me. And yeah, the rest is history, I guess. How long is that ago now? 2 years?
Well, it came out in like January, February-ish of 2 years ago. Yeah, so 2022, I guess.
Wow.
Yeah, that would be it. So it's been some time, and of course, then I was just a guest. But then it didn't take too long before we started covering all the GHB stuff, and it got busier. And then the rest is history, like you said. Yeah, the that when I came over that time, I went to a tournament the next day with my IDK. But when we played our tournament together, is when I brought my city stuff.
That's
And
how
then,
it went. Yep, that's true.
but anyway, in any case, you had put out an ad, or not an ad, but kind of a open invitation.
Craigslist
Oh,
invites.
yeah, open invite on Facebook saying, "Hey, I've got this table I just finished off. Does anyone in the like Benelux area want to come?" So Belgium, the Netherlands, and technically Luxembourg want to come play a game sometime. And I knew I was going to this tournament. It was like, well, it gives me an excuse. I was going to stay for 2 nights anyway. It gave me an excuse to meet a new friend, play a game before the tournament. And you were only my sixth game ever of AoS. And fittingly, I guess, my actual first game of fourth edition was not only with you, but also with IDK. Oh, second game, actually. It was second game. But in any case, it was still within the first six again. So pretty awesome. And here we are. We've come full circle.
Yeah, looking forward to what we're gonna discover today.
Yeah, and you also have like kind of an inkling of interest in Idoneth. You always kind of have. I know you're an kind of elves completionist a bit, although I don't know if you ever really thought about getting into cities elves. But
No,
um,
I'm not that completionist, but yeah, you're completely right. I love all elves, or
yeah.
almost all elves, I guess. Sorry, city elves. Um, no, I love IDK. The only reason why I don't have an IDK army is because I don't like the eel models, and I
Oh
want to
yeah.
play an eel army. But this weekend, or the past weekend, I've been thinking about it, and I think I'm just gonna lean into the Slanesh seahorse-esque models.
Yeah.
What are they called again? The
Yeah.
sleek blade seekers.
Yeah.
Maybe if you've got some IDK bits
Oh,
left
definitely.
over, I can buy them off you and then put them on the Slanish models and make it work. I don't know. I've been brainstorming, but I need to be wary that I'm not starting yet another army right before, for example, the release of the Chaos Dwarves, for example, because that's gonna be an expensive hobby moment for me then. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I love IDK, and I've always kept in touch with their rules and how they play.
The cool thing about if you did this Lanesh thing is they come in boxes of 5.
Yep,
And
that's
I
what I
have
was
a
thinking.
feeling if you bought 3 boxes, you've got 5 units already of 3 eels. And so you're
Hmm.
already in a pretty good setup. You're going to have to cut the legs off, I guess. But anyway, I agree. Those models are prettier. So anyway, you want to go and get into this?
Yeah, let's. I'm
All
excited.
right. So, all right. As before, here we go with battle traits. We're going to do battle traits enhancements. Do some light War Scroll coverage. I mean, I say light, but it's just not going to be as full as everything that's out there. Although I might be making some videos while I'm on kind of vacation over the next few weeks, covering a deeper dive into, say, the Acalian side or the Isharan side or whatever. And then I've got a couple army lists here, and then we're going to kind of have some concluding thoughts, as always. So, pretty straightforward. Let's get on to the battle traits, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. So, This is what the page looks like. We're going to go through each piece separately. Now, the first two pieces, we can go ahead and move on to the first point there for either sea Voyagers. There we go. And we're going to highlight that. The first two kind of work together, as we're seeing with any deploy, like reserve kind of abilities in the game as it is now, because one of them triggers in the deployment phase, and then one triggers in the movement phase. So the deployment phase one, either sea Voyagers, is you basically pick a whole friendly regiment led by an IDK hero. So it couldn't be one of your allies' options as a regiment renown or anything. And specifically, no units in that regiment can already have been deployed. So you can't break it up. And you got to be careful about that. And you got to set that whole unit in reserve. So you got to think, do I want a wizard that's off the table, trying to set up endless spells as magical interventions or whatever, or other kinds of things? Am I okay with that not happening? So you want to be a little selective. And this, I really like something about this rule in particular, because it makes you think real long and hard about exactly how you're going to set up your regiments, which is nice. And you have to think in a tactical way instead of just saying, well, I'll just make it work. I'll make things fit. Fortunately, you can still choose priority target or any other honor guard ability in the current GHB while those units are in reserve. So it's not really limiting you there. And actually, on the contrary, or maybe a flip side of being in deployment in reserve, is that if you are worried about your general or one of his regiment members getting sniped, you can keep them in there until at least the end of the third battle round and keep them protected for a little bit longer. Now, of course, you're losing some utility, but that's one way to keep them protected. So anyway, that's the deployment rule. Let's cover the other one, then Jonas, I'll ask you what you think. So moving on to Raiders from the Deep. So this is how we're going to actually set them up. In just like any of the other abilities, deep strike abilities, this one happens in your movement phase, so not your opponent's. You pick a friendly Idoneth Deepkin unit that is traveling the Either Sea, which is, as we've seen thus far, only via the reserve setup that we just talked about. We're going to see one of the battle formations gives us access to this rule later, which is absolutely my favorite rule I've seen for Idoneth in a long time. So you use this ability, and then you can set up that unit on the battlefield wholly than 9 of any battlefield edge, which is sometimes a bit more generous than we see. Sometimes it's wholly than 6, so that's nice. And then more than 9 from enemy units like we're used to seeing. Important to note that this is an ability that you, the player, use, which means you can use it as many times as you want as you have units for. You could, and you don't in that one movement phase. You don't have to set up. It used to be, this is kind of imitating what Briomdar used to have with the Soul Scryer. And it's still kind of connected to the Soul Scryer, but it used to be something you'd have to choose a sub-faction for. And so you used to drop the Soul Scryer, and then the units he brought with him would have to deploy around him. That's still kind of there, but not officially. So this is flexible. You could put one unit in one corner, one unit in another one near the rest of your army that's kind of in your original deployment zone if you want it. Now, keep in mind, take the flanks won't work with this because you can't be set up in the same turn. So you could set it up one turn in advance and just know that they're in the neighborhood. But you could do the terrain one. I forget what that's called. I forget the name. Do you remember, Jonas, the battle tactic for taking their enemy terrain piece?
Take their land, I think.
Something like it might be, yeah. So anyway, that one would work because it doesn't matter setup. So this is basically your new rule that's kind of thrown the Briomdar deep strike mechanic into your basic rules. Jonas, before we move on to the tides, what are you thinking about these two in combo, and maybe without mentioning the formation too much?
Okay, without mentioning the formation. I just really want to quickly emphasize something that you've probably touched on when you were reading the rules, but the deployment phase ability, Ether Sea Voyagers, is only once per battle. Did you touch on that?
Yeah, the implication, sorry, I might not have made it super clear, but it's just one friendly regiment.
Yeah.
You get to do it with one regiment, that's it.
Yeah, the only reason why I'm emphasizing this is because Stormcast is like the beginner army, I guess. So if you're coming into IDK new, or you're not used to the minute details of 4th edition yet, which is very normal at this point in the game, you might not pick that up. But Stormcast can actually deploy multiple units in the reserve pool, I guess. And here IDK also deploys multiple units, I suppose, but it's only one regiment, so you can't do separate units from different regiments or whatever, because you only get that one chance unless you use the Tidecaster. No, is it the Tidecaster? It's the Soulscryer, or the battle formation, as you mentioned. But yeah, super strong. I like it that it's only one regiment, Ryan. It feels super flavorful. It's like a nod to the previous book, as you mentioned. And I love that it feels a little bit different from the other reserve deployment things that we've seen from other armies. Though I must say, IDK is definitely not lacking in setting things up on a battlefield out of nowhere. So, it almost feels like just a cherry on top, right?
It was a rule that, I mean, honestly, it took me I've played 8 games now, and I've used every unit except for the king, the regular generic king, and have an opinion about him too. But it took me a while to get kind of a feel for when the right timing was for this. And we'll talk about that more later. But because I'll be honest, you don't have a whole lot of models on the table, especially if you're playing like a elite cav build.
Yeah.
And so having a whole, say you have a 2-drop army, having like half your army off the table is sometimes kind of weird. Like, I feel like Stormcast having half off is less awkward than Idoneth. But it's also worth pointing out, you technically could put your whole army in Deep Strike if you took like 2 turtles and then filled it up with, the most expensive stuff you could. But I don't see that as being a viable option. So and you can't.
It'd be interesting though. Very interesting.
It's a choice.
Yeah. Let's move on to the Tides.
Yeah. Okay. So the Tides haven't really changed. For anyone that knows how they used to play back in the day, each battle round, unlike Daughters of Cain, you do get an ability, but they're not cumulative. They switch, and this is so thematic, and I'm glad it's still here. It feels really nice. So in the titles of each of these kind of give you a sense for what's narratively going on. We start with Low Tide, because if you don't know, Idoneth bring a sea with them, kind of like the Everwinter that the ogres bring with them, the Beastclaw. They're bringing the sea with them, and that's how all of their flying stuff. It's like a magical sea that they can fly despite, being in fake water or whatever. And so they come and they try to kind of like put this lulling presence over people so they don't remember what just happened. So that they kind of creep in with the low tide. Flood tide is when the waters obviously are coming in harder. Then we get high tide when it's just like this is the main event, and then they start pulling back before we start over again. And there's this kind of like circle of life kind of vibe that's going on. We used to be able to mess with the tides, but currently, until we get a new battle tome, we're not messing with them at all. So what do we get? Battle round 1 is perhaps the most interesting. Low tide, it says for the rest of the battle round, subtract 1 from hit rolls for shooting attacks that target the unit, and subtract 1 from hit rolls for combat attacks that target the unit if the unit did not charge. Jonas, if you'll go ahead and skip to the next thing, a little box will pop up. There we go. So this is the only one I've got like this. But what's the idea here is that they've changed cover. It used to give them cover, but cover is changed in the game to not only being not +1 to save, but -1 to hit. And it also has this charge stipulation that if you've charged, you don't get to benefit from it. But the problem is cover now doesn't apply for flying units. And most of this army, a good chunk of this army, is flying. Which means if they said it gave you cover, only your Namari and foot heroes would get to use it. So, as I mentioned here, it's functionally giving your largely flying army the ability to use cover for the 1st and 5th battle rounds. So, Jonas, what do you think of Low Tide?
It's pretty good. It's effective. I mean, -1 to hit is very nice. As a Lumineth player with a deep respect for Shining Company, I know how impactful this can be. So having this in the first battle round is also very nice. I don't see it coming up as big in the 5th battle round, though. At that point, I mean, you're probably hanging on with just a couple of models, especially in 4th edition.
Right.
So maybe it's important to have that one model be -1 to hit, I guess. But yeah. Very, very nice. And I love that the charge thingy is there at the end, that you don't get the bonus if you made a charge move, because it's just not very flavorful. They're hiding in the mist, and if you charge out of the mist, then you don't get the -1 to hit. So cool. I like it.
Yeah, and if you're worried about, if you're saying, well, I missed the +1 to save, remember, there's a lot less +1 to save in the game in general now, but also the boats, which we'll cover later, are helping you in that department.
Yeah, and it's +1 to save, actually, it's not always better than -1 to hit, though, right?
It depends. It
Yeah,
depends on their profile. I mean,
yeah,
if they're hitting on fours, I think I would rather, because if they're running on fours, yeah, especially if it's a monster, even, I think I'd rather have them go to fives than have,
exactly. Yeah, and
yeah.
there's so much
So
more things that hit on a 4 now.
yeah, yeah. So I think it can be really impactful, and it's basically just saying, "Don't alpha me, bro."
Yeah.
That's what it's saying.
Don't
Um,
alpha me, bro. That's actually the other name that that they wanted to go with for low tide, but it just didn't fit in the text box anymore.
I mean, we've been calling Loton Broton for long enough that it kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay, on to
okay.
the next tide.
Yeah. So the rest of the tides are basically the same. So, and I won't have any more pop ups, so we can just stay on this slide as is. So flood tide is for the rest of the battle round. This unit can use a run ability and still use shoot and or charge, which is really great for this army because essentially the story we're telling here is you play defensive on turn one and a little caddy, and maybe just try to stay out of people's effect range. Then in battle round two, you set yourself up. You might not actually want to, charge on that turn, but you definitely are probably wanting to shoot if you have those shooting units, and this can help you get back into decent range. And then battle round three is when you have your strike first fest, which I can go ahead and cover here, and then we can talk about the two. Maybe we'll talk about all three together. So battle round three, you're getting strike first for your whole army, and of course, if someone gives you strike last, that just means that you activate in the normal sequence of events, which does happen sometimes in the game. I think there's a lot more strike first, strike last being given out now in the edition from what I've seen. And then it's worth keeping in mind that the army has a lot of better performance on the charge. Like the turtle's better on the charge, Volturnos is better. The Eidolon of the Storm, the Morsar Guard, the Ishlian Guard, a lot of the army wants to be charging. And they're not super tanky. And so you really have to play smart. And this is always how the army's played. But I think the fact that there's no like king combo like we used to have with the super buffed up Kalian King with all kinds of debuffs and buffs. We just don't have that to rely on anymore. And I think the game has become simultaneously more and less deadly depending on which aspect you're looking at. I've found that you got to be choosy about what you're going in, a little choosier than before. Because battle shock going away is great for your big units, but for your eels units, you weren't worried about battle shock anyway. They're just dying. And they're the Ishlian Guard are not as tanky as they once were. I think so. There's a lot of kind of a push and pull here going on. And then before we talk about it together, Ebb Tide, I'll just say this is helping with your always be charging kind of mentality. Is that in the whole fourth battle run you can retreat and still shoot and or charge, which is really great. And of course, you're not suffering damage, which is the second clause or sentence there for doing so. This is particularly good with all those units that want to be charging all the time. The Eidolon the Storm has the retreat and charge built in, so that's great. And the Namari Reavers, the shooting unit, have retreat and or run plus shoot, not charge though, built into their war scroll. But when they retreat, they do take damage, except in battle round 4. So this is kind of the flow, and then like I said, we go back to defensive. Jonas, what are you thinking about this kind of suite of options that we've got here? Do you feel like it's changed in going into the fourth edition at all? Do you feel like it's basically functioning the way it always has?
Yeah, it feels. I mean, as someone on the receiving end, it feels much the same. I do want to say that high tide it remains very scary, but it's less scary now because damage is just less explosive.
Yes.
So while I do dread the full third battle round when I play against IDK, I am not as scared anymore as I used to be because taking 2 full turns of Slap King to your face was horrendous, and now I'm like, I can weather the storm maybe. Especially because I do feel that there's much more source of strike loss in the game now.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit less effective than it was before, but I do feel overall it's still very much the same. I think if you're playing IDK, it probably feels very much the same. Battle round 2, running and shooting and charging is always nice. I don't really feel like it's super necessary. Maybe if you're running full Namari, what's your experience on that with the Flood Tide?
Yeah. I mean, I've only gotten 8 games in, but I do think the Namari needs
The Namari what?
And the Namari need it more than the eels,
Yeah.
as you're implying. And then the thing is, the Reavers don't really want to charge anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so they've already got run and shoot.
Yeah.
So I'm less convinced by the shooting output of the sharks and the turtle. So when it comes to shooting, I feel like it's mainly that part is just already kind of built in for the one war scroll. It's more the run and charge, I guess. But yeah, kind of to your point about the game being less lethal, is you used to kind of think, well, let's say I'm going second in battle round 2. I want to take run and charge and go in and lock them in combat so that even if they take the turn, they're stuck in combat with me or they have to retreat with my strike first for the whole next battle round. Now I'm not so sure because my Morsar Guard, which I've used quite extensively at this point, um, if they get stuck in combat and they can't retreat and get back in and get the charge bonuses, they're kind of a wet noodle. Like
Yep.
they're not doing a whole lot. I'd rather have Ishling guard at that point. And yeah, you just I don't know. It's you sit kind of just around like slapping each other and not doing a whole lot. So I doubt that I'm like my strategy moving forward is going to necessarily as much as it was before, trying to get stuck in by the end of battle round 2 so that I get a full battle round of striking first. I don't know that that's as helpful as it once was. I think the army needs to go delete a unit so that it is free to charge in the next turn,
Mm-hmm.
either with a counter charge or otherwise.
Yep. I agree.
Okay. And then retreat and charge. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Very strong.
Yeah, the thing is, you got to actually be in combat, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
The thing is that by the time of battle round 4 comes around, it's taking D3 mortal damage is actually quite impactful in certain cases.
Yeah.
And being able to charge after a retreat move actually allows you to get a lot of movement in, especially with a bunch of endless spells now. I do think it's very impactful actually to maybe to be able to leap across the battlefield a little bit easier or something like that. Especially when your teleporting casters are gone or dead. So
Yeah.
yeah, I do feel like all of them are very impactful, except for Battle Round 2, the Flood Tide. I've just not really found a unit that really wants this buff necessarily. A lot of units that want to run in charge don't necessarily need it in the IDK book, except maybe Thralls.
Yeah, I suppose I could see it also for getting in with the things that are now chargeable but aren't threatening, like a manifestation or a faction terrain piece.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah.
and then that could help you get a good positioning for the next round.
Mm.
So you can run, get over there, charge one of those things, and then not be scared of it
Yeah, and that's
as
interesting.
much as I
Interesting. Yeah.
so that could be a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's something I'm still going to have to get a feel for.
Okay. Shall we move on?
Okay. Yeah, let's do it. So we're moving on to the 4 formations. So as anyone that's paying attention knows, this is basically our replacement for sub factions. And I'll be honest, I think this is actually a pretty decent set overall. But we'll talk about it in a second. But let's start with Namari Core, which is perhaps my least favorite. So here's the rule. It's you can re-roll run rolls and charge rolls for friendly Namardi units while they are wholly within 12 inches of a friendly Acalian unit. So let's think about what this means. We actually only have 2 Namardi units. That's going to be our Reavers and our Thralls. One's for shooting, one's for combat. Both are glass cannony. And they have to be wholly within 12 inch of a friendly Acalian unit. So the Acalians are going to be the rest of your army except for the 2 Eidolons and the Isharan heroes. So like Loton and the 3 casters. So that's including a foot guy. That'll be the Acalian Thrallmaster, who's at the same speed as the Thralls. So unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to necessarily keep up with them. Now, then you've got, of course, like Volturnos, the other king, the turtle, the sharks, and the eels. So, in thinking about what this actually means, I had like my little summary above. I said it's a mixed arms build. These are mixed arms builds to help your foot troops try to keep up with your cavalry / Leviathan. The thing is, I don't know if you actually want that. Like, it is good, I guess, to keep those guys up with them, but re-rolling run and charge, like um, with the shooting units, they do the Reavers have a They have a 12-inch range, so getting to reroll like a 1 to guarantee that you get in range is something. I don't hate it. And then for the charging of the thralls, like say like Lotan, his buff, he's got a once per game buff that can benefit the thralls. The Thrall Master has a buff that you always want to be holier than 12-inch for. But other and then the turtle is maybe another combo because the turtle is now projecting a 6-inch holier than bubble of 5-up ward. So I could see maybe a world where they want to keep hugging around a turtle and he's moving faster than they are. So it's kind of helping guarantee that they're sticking in and that they get that land that charge. But I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this one. Do you have any thoughts, Jonas, that you want to add?
It's all right. I think as you mentioned, they're all pretty good, and I didn't feel like the Namari core was very bad. It's just the most boring one, maybe. Or Isharan console seems boring on the surface, but I feel like it has a lot more tech in it. This one is a little bit more straightforward. Though, I mean, if you're running 20 thrall in a unit of 20 thralls and you fail your charge, that really sucks. So
Yeah, I mean, failing charge always sucks, and then it keeps you free from having to use a CP. So you know, I don't know. It's something, but I just don't know. It's forcing you to take some Achillean stuff, and the Achillean stuff, except for the turtle and maybe well, the Thrall Master definitely. The turtle, the Thrall Master, and Volturnos don't have a whole lot of overlap with the Namari units. So I don't know.
it would have been it would have been interesting if it also had allowed the Achilleans to reroll their charges, but then that would have probably been a little bit too strong.
Agreed. Yeah. So yeah, but it is what it is. Or maybe if we get another Namarti unit, I like that has some other function. Maybe a tankier Namarti unit that's slower or something. I could see that maybe being a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the time being, I don't know what to think of. But yeah, maybe let's move on to the Beastmasters.
Sure.
So the next one is basically it does what it says on the tin. It's for people that want to run like elite cav and turtle type builds. Because your Achillean units are going to be the ones that have companions. Basically, it's with the exception, I guess, technically of some guys that have some little fish floating around like the Eidolons. But anyway, Achillean Beastmasters adds 1 to hit rolls for combat attacks made with companion weapons by friendly Achillean units. Now, for anyone that's not been paying attention, any buff that you see anywhere in the game that says add 1, like for example, the Eidolon has +1 to wound for your units. And you're thinking, "Oh, that's great. I'd love to take this with my sharks and my eels and like the kings." Yeah, but that's only going to impact their the riders because anything that has the companion profile absolutely does not benefit from anything that impacts their attack profiles unless it explicitly says so. So as in what we see with all out attack and what we see with this ability. So if you want your eels, which are all of those things, that, if I'm not mistaken, are hitting on 4s. If you want them to go to a more reasonable 3, you either have to use alt attack, but obviously you can only use that on 1 unit, or you can have this just passive ability that's always applying. Now, our game was with this, and I do think it's really nice. I think it's kind of the smooth brain option because it's just guaranteeing that you have more efficiency if you're rolling into that stuff, and then you don't have to maintain bubbles or do anything crazy. You're just always getting it, and that's real nice. That said, I don't know if this wins you games as much as some of the others we're going to talk about. But what are you thinking right here on these guys, Jonas? I mean, obviously you were talking about running a kind of eels list. Is this something you'd be interested in?
Yeah, so initially I had included this battle formation for my full eels list, but I came to this weird point where I was list building and thinking, well, it's super nice to have, obviously, and as you mentioned, it is not as flashy as some of the other ones, but it's just smooth brain. But then sometimes you really want to, let's say, all out attack your 6 eel units, and then this is kind of wasted, right? Unless your opponent also has a -1 to hit debuff on themselves.
Yeah.
So it almost felt like if you're getting into combat with, let's say, 2 units at best that are very delete-y, do you actually still need this as much as some of the other ones you might need? So If you're going full eels, I think it's interesting, but I might still opt for the last one, actually, for Soulraider ambushers. But we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get on to Isharan Council.
Yep.
I think the next two are the techie ones.
Mm-hmm.
So this one's complicated, so I'm going to try to explain it as shortly as possible. What it's doing is it's adding. Okay, let's go to the second part. If your Isharan units are within combat range, so 3 inches of any other friendly Isharan units, that Isharan unit gets +1 the following abilities. Okay, so first off, let's talk about who the Isharan units are. That's going to be Lotan, who is unique and is the one of the 2 Italics heroes that you can bring inside a regiment, like a heroes regiment.
But he doesn't have ritual rolls, the lure light, or casting, does he?
No, he's the one, but he does benefit
Yeah,
quite.
he gives
We'll
the
talk about
buff
what
to others. Yeah.
Yeah, he's actually really strong, but he's kind of our totem, if you will, because he's adding +3 to control scores for all Idoneth units within 12, and then also adding +1 to casting rolls. So implicitly, if you're bringing him, you're going to be giving out +2 to cast, because as we see, the first point here is adding 1 to casting rolls. So let's talk about who the casters are. We got a Tidecaster at 150 points, and a Soul Scryer, which is probably one of my favorite new utility tech pieces, at 120 points, who's also a 1 caster, and would be getting this buff. So they're both going to be at +1 to cast. And if Lotan's standing around +2 to cast, which is really strong.
Yeah.
And especially considering what our spells are, or one of our spells is. And then, he used to be a priest. So instead of giving us a prayer lore, which I fully expected, they just decided to make him a caster, which actually is I'm happy for because of the situation. Now, the Isharan ritual rolls we'll talk about later when we're talking about the Tidecaster, but it's basically, like we've seen across a lot of armies, an ability that maybe used to go off for free that now goes off on a 3+, but by adding +1 means it's going off 5 out of 6 times, which is the kind of reliability I'm looking for in a list. And so if you really need the Tidecaster's ability, which we'll talk about later, this is very clutch. And then lastly, the Lure Light roll is for the Soul Render's ability to bring. He's not a caster, unfortunately, but his ability to bring back Namari. And the cool thing about this is it's a D3 roll, and by adding 1 to a D3 roll that goes off on a D3 2+, it goes off automatically. I've asked Tom Makis for confirmation of this. That just means every time you roll, you are definitely bringing back at least 1 model instead of there's a 33% chance that you don't bring back any model.
That's cool.
So very cool. Now it's and every one of your Soul Renders, if I'm not mistaken, I'll double check that real quick, gets to use that ability in a turn. I don't think it's a once per turn ability.
It's not once per turn, but you cannot target the same units twice.
Yeah, so you could spread out and then do that.
Yeah.
And then hit multiple units, which is kind of cool. So that's kind of a Morphon build. So basically, you're getting a ton of buffs built into this one rule. But the trick is you got to keep those heroes alive. So first off, it's implicitly raising your drops, because to get 1 of each hero, and then maybe Lotan, you're talking about at least 3 drops, 1 of each type of hero, I mean. But you remember, you don't actually have to take all of it. So this is my point that I said above. It gives a suite of amazing buffs to your buff pieces, increasing reliability, even if only leaning into 1 or 2 of these. So let's say you don't need the Lure Light rolls to bring back Namari. I still think it's worth it for the buff to the Tidecaster, or even just the buff for the casting.
Definitely.
If you brought just a Soul Scryer and just Lotan, you're getting +2 to cast, and you're you're sitting in a good place, but with the extra control score buff that Lotan's giving, and that's only 1 drop. So I don't know. I still think it's pretty solid, even if you don't fully lean into this rule, which is not always the case with these formations. I don't think I would take Achillean Beastmasters just for 1 unit to benefit from it. So what are you thinking? I've talked at length about it. What are you thinking about this one?
Yeah, I could not agree more with everything that you've said. It's so strong. It reminds me a little bit of, it's obviously a more potent version of the Namari Council thing that the Lumineth have going on. And me and Siegfried, we were really down on it at first. And I've come around a little bit now, because a lot of casting values are sitting at 6, 7, and 8 now. And having that +1 or +2 basically guarantees you getting all of your spells off, or at least not guarantees, but the chance of you getting off are so big compared to what they are to Unbind, because let's say you're casting on a 7, that's already, you know, a big chance that you get that 7 to cast off. Now that counts as an 8, so your opponent actually has to roll a 9, and with how few unbind bonuses there are now in the game, that's actually really, really difficult. So I think if you're going with a 3rd edition mindset and you're looking at this ability, it doesn't seem all that impressive. But if you're thinking about 4th edition and you know, the state of the game and how potent manifestations are right now, this can be really, really strong. And as you mentioned, combined with Lotan, that's very juicy. And also, I was very down on the Tidecaster War Scroll when we were doing the faction focus review, because we did not know that there was a way to increase her ritual success rolls, or the success for the ritual rolls. But now that they've got the Isharan Council, yeah, I love it a lot. It's super flavorful. Yeah, big fan.
Yeah, and if you stand next to a place of power, which is what I've been doing, it just
It's
then
what?
you're getting camping around a place of power, you know, where every hero phase you can trigger it, you're getting up to +3 to cast. And that's for every one of your heroes that's standing around that. It's not just for one. So you basically got, like, who's got +3 to cast right now? Does Nagash has only got +2? I mean, like, do the Slan have +3? I don't know.
No, I don't
But
think so. Not anymore.
I mean, obviously they could use Arcane Place of Power as well. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, the fact that you've got it on multiple heroes, and remember, just skipping ahead a little bit, we've got a teleport spell and it's unlimited. So if you need separate wizards for that, and even though the Eidolon of the Sea is amazing, you can only cast the teleport once from the Eidolon of the Sea, but for less points, you are just, I think it's 30 points more. You can do Lotan, Soulscar, and Tidecaster, both being at +2 to cast, +3 if they're around a place of power, and that's 2 sources of teleporting, which kind of almost guarantees it at a casting value of 6. So anyway, let's move on to the next one, which is actually my favorite.
Same.
It took a while before I started playing this, but it's so powerful. So what does it do? Once per turn, end of your turn. If it was end of every turn, I would never choose anything else. But it's once per turn, end of your turn. Pick a friendly Idoneth Deepkin infantry or cavalry unit holier than 3 inch of a terrain feature. And I will say this is the most restrictive part.
Yeah.
That sometimes it's hard to be holier than 3 inches of a terrain feature, which is one of the reasons I would suggest splitting your boat up into 2 separate pieces so that you've got more options, even though it means they're easier to shoot off. Okay, what do? We remove that unit from the battlefield and set it up in reserve, traveling the Either Sea, so the same thing as before, from the battle trait. Now, you might be thinking, Ryan, the way 3rd edition reserve rules worked was that no matter how you got into reserve, you had to put that unit on the table by the end of turn 3, or else they died in reserve. But in the current wording of the reserve rule, it says that this is only true if you put them in reserve as a deploy ability, which means you can actually put, using this rule, a unit back in, like, in the middle of the game. You can put it back into the Either Sea and it can stay there indefinitely. But it also means you could put them in turn 5 as a surprise objective steal, or as a whatever else you need to do tactically. And keep in mind, even though the normal deep strike for the traveling the Either Sea is to put it holier than 9 at the board edge, your Soul Scar is going to open up the possibilities a lot. And considering you can teleport that Soul Scar anywhere you want with one, either his own cast or the cast of some other wizard nearby, you can very easily be jumping around the board and creating new locuses or loci for places that they could be deep striking. Granted, he can only bring 1 unit in that way per turn. So what I've been doing with this, it took me a while to kind of get a feel for this, but you basically put a whole regiment into reserve. So you've already got all of those units that have this option. And then every turn, you try to set up multiple units to squeeze next to a terrain piece so that you have multiple options and your opponent doesn't know who you're going to pull. And then you pull someone, put them back in reserve. And remember, one of the well, we haven't talked about it, but the Tidecaster's ability is to add, one of the abilities is +1 to run and charge rolls, which means even if you drop them outside of 9 of your opponent, you only need to hit an 8-inch charge. If you drop them outside of 7, like the Soul Square lets you do, then you only need a 6-inch charge, which is really powerful. This ability has so much built-in tech that even though I want the Isharan Council like buffs really badly for the extra pluses, this is so game winning to be able to do this every single turn and set something in deep strike and then bring it down whenever you want. So as I said above, amazing tactical flexibility, especially combined with Soul Scryer and or teleport, protecting your otherwise fragile assets. So for example, a good example, taking a big block of Reavers, you let everyone shoot. Now they're on big 32 mil bases, so it's going to be hard to be wholly within 3 inches of a terrain piece. But if you can pull it off, you let them all shoot. And then at the end of the turn, you put them back into the sky. So they're, especially if they're in your general's regiment, so they're not even on the table anymore to kill. And then you bring them again, and then outside of 9 or outside of 7, and then maybe they do a redeploy. But if you set them up strategically, they can only, maybe you have 2 units that they can all shoot. And so you'll always have an option. There's so much flexibility with this that I just can't understate it. Like, I think this is the winning sub-faction here of the formation. Jonas, what do you want to add to that? Sorry for talking so long.
Well, if you're a Sylvaneth player, you're real mad right now.
Oh yeah.
I mean, in some ways, Ryan, this is much better than what the Sylvaneth got as a specific faction ability, right? Because okay, sure, Sylvaneth have a hole within 6 inches, but it has to be within range of their trees, and their trees are destroyable. But this is wholly within 3, which is, you know, not a big distance, of course, but any terrain feature. You know, keep in mind there's on average 8 pieces on the battlefield right now, and then you're adding your own 1 or 2 shipwrecks to that as well, and then your opponent also has a terrain feature most likely, or, you know, half of the time. So there's actually a ton of places where you can teleport from and to. It's yeah, it's amazing. It's really, really strong. Yeah.
And being able to bring something on turn 5, I don't want to understate how valuable that is. And there's a reason why GW has traditionally never let that happen.
Mm-hmm.
So if this forced you to bring it down by turn 3, I probably wouldn't take it, if I'm being honest, because you could only put 1 unit in the sky or in reserve per turn. And so, like, you put something in 1, then you bring it in on 2. Maybe you put something in 2, but then you bring it in, and then the ability stops doing a thing. But that's not how it works anymore. So you're just always thinking about setting up that next unit to put in the sea. So
yeah.
Okay. So maybe let's move on, and we'll talk about applications of those rules later. I've got a rule for both council and ambushers. Oh, and then choosing the best battle formation. I said, like, unlike some indexes, these really determine the flavor and utility of your army. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with me on that?
Yep.
Like, some armies just don't have. Yeah.
Yeah.
I said you definitely want to build around these formations if you can. And it's overall a flexible set of options, rewarding players for experimenting with different builds despite the relatively small army roster. Anything you want to add to those points?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the first 2 are probably the ones that you have to build around, while the second 2 are totally fine to just take in whatever list you want. I mean, obviously, you know, for an Isharan council, you need 2 Isharan units to be there, but Soulraider Ambusher fits in all non-full turtle lists, right? And even the Isharan council would totally work in a lot of lists as long as you have 2 Isharan units. So I do feel like the first 2 are more required to build around than the other 2.
Yeah, I do think the Soulraider Ambushers needs a Soul Scryer, but other than that,
fair enough.
Agree with you. But I would agree. It's just tech, just straight up tech.
Yeah.
I might not have leaned in on it hard enough, but it's worth pointing out the Soulraider Ambushers limits only infantry and cavalry to being able to do it, so the Eidolons and the turtle can't go in. I think you might have kind of just referenced that, but those are the ones that can't do the deep strike. They could do the deep strike, the initial deep strike, but they can't do this one. So.
Yeah, I mean, would their bases even fit wholly within 3 inches of something?
Well, if they're in the middle of a woods.
Oh yeah, that's fair. Yeah, if they're in the terrain feature. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, let's move on. So we got, I believe, heroic terrain. Oh, faction terrain. Yeah.
Faction terrain.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've got 3 little points. We can do this one quickly. The boat has cover, impassable, and obscuring. Now, cover, you're not going to benefit from a whole lot unless you have most of your army flies. So it's not going to be giving you -1 to hit if being shot. But, you know, if there's some rule that comes out for cover, that's kind of nice. Impassable means you can fly over it, but they can't. And you're no longer going inside the boat, just for pointing that out. You used to be able to garrison it with smaller units. And then obscuring is actually really nice because even though you can physically see through the boat, it's quite large, even if you separate them into two separate parts. And then your foot heroes aren't shootable; they're not visible then. So that's kind of nice. Um, then let's move on to the next point, which is just how you deploy it. Yeah, so we have a choice of 2 pieces at 7 health each with a 4-up save, or 1 big piece with 14 health. I've done a little bit of the full boat, but mostly split it up for reasons I've already mentioned. It is easier to kill. Of course, you need to be careful about terrain pieces in general, setting them too far up front, upfield, because your opponent might charge into them and then just get a free kind of like a slingshot into where you actually are. But that's true of manifestations as well. That said, there is some strategic value of if say you had like 6 objectives on table, of putting on your side of the board one in between the halfway point of the 2 of them, and then the other one in between the other halfway point. Then you've got kind of a 6-inch bubble, which is the next ability we'll talk about. We can go ahead and move on to that. The 6-inch bubble holier than for your infantry and cavalry, which again is everything but the Leviathan, which doesn't really need it, and then the 2 Eidolons also kind of don't need it. Of +1 to save, and that's a really nice ability. If the bubble were bigger, I'd be even more enthusiastic, of course, but I'll take holier than 6. Granted, if you're doing the rule that we were just talking about with going into deep strike again, into reserve, you need to be hugging 3 inches holier than anyway, so you're implicitly getting it if you're using the boat. Yeah, so what are your thoughts about the boat, Jonas?
I mean, I have a flying temple that does a bunch of things, so it's a little bit less cool, but I think it's still very strong. You use it so efficiently against me as well. You use it a lot. It's so big, and you can block off entire lanes on a table now, and then you being able to hide behind it is actually really nice as well, because not only do you have the obscuring buff there, but the +1 to save is also super cool because it also works versus combat attacks and such. So just hug your terrain piece and you're golden.
Yeah, and if they kill it, then great. They put some attacks into it. You want to move around anyway, so you're not trying to hunker down behind it for the whole game. And plus, even your little soft heroes can teleport away to safety. So yeah, I think it's totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on now to the heroic traits. So we got all 3 of the things here. We don't have a manifestation, the regular 3 spell lore. If we move on to the heroic traits as our first slide here, we got 3. A passive ability, and of course these are going on any of your hero, Volturnos, Loton. If the unmodified hit roll for a combat attack, not shooting, that targets this unit is a 1, 2, or 3, it fails and the attack sequence ends. Which means if they're already hitting on 4s, all attack is pointless, but otherwise it doesn't have a big impact. Obviously, on the turn that you have -1 to hit, this is, again, maybe doing something, maybe not. But I typically take this one just to keep my big Eidolons alive. I feel like it's pretty strong. Obviously, it's not working with shooting, but still, like it's taking the really elite troops. It's nerfing them quite a bit. It's basically giving them -1, sometimes -2 to hit functionally. Jonas, what do you think about this one?
It's so strong and so annoying to play against. Wow. The fact that you can put it on an Eidolon is totally nuts. It's crazy. I really thought they would have said, excluding Eidolons, but having this on either the Storm or the Seas is amazing. Really, really strong.
Yeah, and the only other really beat sticky hero you'd put it on would be the Akalian King, but I have mixed feelings about the King.
Same. And I mean, you could take this even further with an artifact as well if you wanted to, but we will get to that in a bit.
Yeah, so let's move on to Hunter of Souls. That'll be our next one. This one's kind of like, there's always going to be an artifact in some books that is just built for making your big hero even better at doing hero fighty stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It gives the unit's melee weapons anti-hero +1 rend. Now, I will say on the Eidolon of the Storm, he's actually built to be anti-hero because he's got a rampage against a hero that makes it so that they strike last.
And he's also got anti-hero on his weapon already, doesn't he?
I don't believe so. I think he just got +1 to damage on the charge. I
might have remembered wrong.
Yeah, it's just +1 damage on the charge. Okay. But he does have that rampage for a hero. So he's kind of like, they kind of are trying to tell you maybe put this on him, and then he'd have +3 rend, which is nice. But honestly, you've got so few units on the table, and people are trying to keep low drops, and they don't have a ton of heroes. That right now I just can't. I'd rather keep him alive with Ancient Pride
Yeah,
than be having him maybe a little better at killing a hero.
for sure.
But it is what it is. Any thoughts on that?
Um, I mean, it's as you said. It just makes a unit that's already good versus something even better. The fact that there's a bunch of big heroes around does make me think that this is more impactful than it might seem at first. But you've got the Ancient Pride there, and that's also the most effective thing against heroes, because most big heroes that you're afraid of are gonna hit you on a 3 or 2 anyway. So yeah, pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the last one, Nightmare Legacy. One I've got some. I think it might actually be nice, but
Okay.
it's end of any turn. You have to pick a visible enemy unit that had any damage points allocated to it this turn by an ability used by this unit to be the target. So you're immediately thinking, well, combat damage, but it doesn't have any range. So it could be a spell that you use. Now, I don't think the endless spells damage would count, because even though you cast it, it's not you using an ability, it's the spell using the ability. But if you have a spell that can do some damage, we have a little bit of that in this army. No, it's only an anti-horde spell, so I wouldn't rely on it. But if it's a big horde unit, then it would work, because we've got a spell that's you roll as many dice as there are models in the unit, and 5 up does more damage. And maybe that's the one that you want to be subtracting from its control score. And it's got a range of 18, so it means basically you could have even walked away after the magical interventioning or whatever, and then there's no range restriction here. And then you're subtracting d6 from their control score for the rest of the turn. I think there could be some tech here, and it depends on how much that comes into play, especially considering Idoneth armies, if they're not running Namari, are often very low control score armies, especially with Lotan not hanging around. I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about this one. Obviously, this Eidolon the Sea is probably the target you want here, because then it's the caster, so it can do it from a distance, that one spell. It's also got a shooting attack that's not bad. And then it could go into combat and do a little, but I'll say it's kind of underwhelming. We'll see that later on one of my War Scroll focuses. Jonas, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I have a Cathalar in my army selection as a Lunith player, and she has the same ability, or almost the same. I don't really dig the things that reduce control scores on a D6, because, or by a D6, because D6 could be 1, and that really sucks. So yeah, it's a little bit weird. I think it could have some play with the Soulraider battle formation, because you could put it on a unit that you've just dealt damage to, then reduce their control score by whatever it does. And if you roll low enough, you or too low, sorry, you just stay on your objective. And if you roll high enough for your smallish other unit to maybe overcap your opponents, as you can teleport away, something like that. It just seems a little bit iffy. I just like an heroic trait that does something always, and not on a d6 roll or something like that. So yeah, I'm not a big fan, but I think it can have some play.
Yeah, it's at least subtracting 1, which honestly has made a difference in some of my objective control on tiny objectives but I still like Ancient Pride more. It's also worth pointing out, we weren't sure at the time when they covered some units that could reduce control score, but they have clarified in the rules that a control score can never be reduced to 1 or lower than 1.
Yeah.
So you can't make it go negative or make it be 0. So if it could, then I would think maybe that could be even techier. But yeah, which one are you taking?
Ancient Pride.
Yeah,
every time.
Yeah.
I mean, not every time. If I'm not bringing in a Killing King or an Eidolon of any sort, then I might not actually bring Ancient Pride, to be honest, and also not Hunter of the Souls. Then, so then it's gonna be Nightmare Legacy.
Yeah, I agree. Yep, that's fair. And I think Nightmare Legacy is the only target you put that on. Be the Eidolon of the Sea.
Yeah,
I could see it maybe on the Storm, but I'd rather just keep him alive with the Ancient Pride. So, yeah. Okay. All right, let's move on to the artifacts. We got 3 as well. We're going to start with Armor the Sithai. People seem to like this one. I'm less convinced, but It says, other than the companion weapon ability, weapon abilities for attacks that target this unit have no attacks that are have no effect. That impacts shooting abilities as well, but it does specifically say attack, so it's not like magic or anything like that. Of course, there are no weapon abilities for magic, but just keeping that in mind. Now, why does it say other than the companion ability? Well, it's saying basically we're not going to help your opponent out by stripping them of the companion ability. It basically means we're going to keep the negative ability that's on them, but we're going to take away all the other ones. So let's say they've got crit mortals or auto wound or whatever, charge +1 damage. All of those go away if they come into your target. Now, depending on how the meta is looking, I think this might actually be stronger than armor or than Ancient Pride. But of course, you could stack them. So I do think it's really nice.
Yeah, it's not nice, Ryan. It's disgusting that you can't stack these.
Well, I think it's The thing
you're putting all your eggs in one basket, though. So I know that's what you're gonna go for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I do actually like something about both the other ones as well.
Yeah.
So
same.
Yeah, so let's talk about all three of them, and then we can talk about them together. So Delicious Morsels will be the next one. I love this one, actually.
Yeah.
I use this with you. Any movement phase, so once per turn, though, but in your opponent's movement phase as well. And you can choose the order that this happens. So you can move all your targets to being within combat range of the hero that's got this, because it heals D3 for every one of your cavalry units within its combat range. That's going to be Volturnos and the King. That's going to be both eels, and that's going to be the sharks. Not the turtles, not the Eidolons. So not everything that flies. But healing D3 on really sensitive units is great, and consider this in conjunction with a rally. So if you had rallied, let's see, you want to rally your next turn, you heal the unit back up to full health, and even though you could have done this with rally anyway, it's more increasing the likelihood that on, say, an eel unit, you roll 4, and they've got a musician, so you've got 7 rolls, that you roll 4 or more 4 pluses, and then you bring a whole eel back. But if they're wounded, then you could, of course, still do that, but then you've got a wounded eel too. So when you combine these, you're getting a lot of functionality there. And a lot of times, especially the Eidolon of the Storm, who could carry this, or a king who also wants to be around your eels, especially, to get that +1 to wound on the Eidolon, or fight right after the Achaian king, then you're seeing a reason to keep them hugging each other and keep them around each other. So I actually think if you're running enough cavalry and you're not planning on sending your Eidolon or king off into a corner somewhere, that there's actually a lot of value here, because you're healing on average 4 wounds per cavalry unit per battle round, which is pretty strong on an otherwise like vulnerable, like let's say Volturnos. Volturnos, easy to snipe, and putting him back up to a full 8 wounds or health worth of health stat is nothing to sneeze at. Let's talk about Dritch Leech real quick, and then Jonas, I want to get your opinion on. So this is just an 18-inch static bubble that if you're around this guy, you're at -1 to cast. I think this is particularly good on one of the Eidolons, especially maybe the Storm, who's a little more inclined to go into combat, especially if he's got Ancient Pride in. So he's just always be charging, and then he's projecting a big old bubble in the middle of the board, perhaps, to really reduce the casting efficiency of your opponent's wizards, which I think is actually really strong, considering what you said about where we're sitting with casting values now and buffs. So I think there's some play with all 3 of these, actually. I don't think any of the artifacts are bad, and it depends on what you think you're going to need the most. Jonas, where are you sitting with these 3?
I completely agree with the last bit that you said. They're all strong. There's a situation for all of them. I think I was initially drawn to the Armor of Sithai when I was list building, because it just seems so dirty to combine with the other thing, the heroic traits. The one that's not letting you hit on 1, 2, 3s. But you could also not just stack this on one guy. You could spread over 2 Eidolons, for example. That's also very potent. The Delicious Morsels is something that I was going for with my eels list, though. I mean, healing 2d3 per battle round is super nice, don't get me wrong. I do wonder how often that you're going to be within combat range with certain heroes, especially with eels. Then you need a fast hero to keep up with those eels. That's probably an Eidolon, but then maybe your Eidolon's teleporting around. You're probably not taking a Killian King for reasons that we will get to in a little bit. So I think actually, although this was actually my pick for my list, this is probably my least favorite one. And then Dritch Leech seems really bad, again, when you're looking at it from a 3rd edition perspective. But from 4th edition, this is really hemorrhaging for certain armies. Yeah. Especially considering how impactful manifestations are right now. I mean, in our game, Ryan, our game Lumineth versus Idoneth, we both had one model left. And while your model was worth way more than mine and was way more impactful, I do really think that the endless spells there really played a big part in your victory as well.
100%. Yeah.
So if I had a chance to decrease your casting rolls there, or even if you decreased mine, that would have been even worse for me. So I think this looks weak, but is very, very strong against certain armies. But that's the thing, right? It's only against certain armies, and in armies where you only have maybe one wizard, they might be fine with staying away 18 inches. Then you don't get the benefit from this at all, unless you're going YOLO with your teleports, as you mentioned. But then do it take it on an Eidolon of the Storm and definitely give him some protection.
Yeah. One last thing about the cavalry thing that I've been doing is, I know you're thinking you want to send stuff off, but a lot of times what I'll do is I'll send something off to do a mission, if you will, and then teleport them back to around my hub. Yeah. Because the army likes it. One unit of eels is, I can tell you right now, is not deleting as much as you think it is. Mm-hmm. It's real shaky, and if you don't kill everything, you're sitting in a bad place for the next turn.
Yeah.
And so what I've been doing is largely I'm learning to play more cattily, where I strike, I kind of teleport out and put it back next to the guy so that I can use the ability. Like if you use magical intervention, then you can still use in the movement phase to heal them back up. And then what you're doing is you're moving your whole shoal, which is a group of fish, right? Mm-hmm. You're moving your whole shoal to work together in conjunction, because the king's putting out a buff. Volturnos is putting out a buff of +1 to hit for the riders of all the Kalians, holier than 12. The Eidolon of the Storm is as well. And so you're flowing around the battlefield to go take objectives, go do things, but largely delete things in a very precision kind of way. So I agree. All of these are great. But I think there is some tech in there, especially if you're teleporting and then deep striking with the Soul Raid thing to put them back next to that hero in the movement phase, because you can do it before you trigger this ability. So there's a lot of utility. Depends on how much cavalry you're leaning to.
Yeah, so. True.
All right, so let's go to the spell lore.
Yeah.
There's one spell that's amazing, and the other two are just there. But fortunately, the spell that's amazing is our unlimited spell.
Totally insane.
This used to teleport a hero, even just an allied hero. Cool. But now, so Steed of Tides, casting value 6, not complaining, especially with all the buffs that we've got.
6 for teleport, Ryan.
Yeah, you pick any Idoneth unit you want, holier than 12, and because it doesn't explicitly say that they can't be in combat, you can teleport them out of combat. And then you just hit the casting roll, remove the target from the battlefield, set it up again on the battlefield more than 9 outside enemy units. And remember, we do have a +1 to run and charge in this army, or charge, I should say, in this context. And you could, of course, teleport them to around a terrain feature so that they're set up for your deep strike, or your going back in reserve, which is really powerful. Go steal an objective. There's a lot of crazy stuff you could do with this. Go teleport a wizard and then have them do one of the other spells, or set up an endless spell, or anything. There's so many options here, and the fact that you can do it per wizard. I think there's definitely a version of reality where you have 1 Tidecaster and 2 Soul Scryers. And then you got 3 teleporters, plus you've got a whole great like Morbid Conjuration lore. That's the one I've been taking the whole time. You've got Loton in your list, maybe buffing them, just giving them +1 to cast. You put them around an Arcane Place of Power. You could teleport 1 to go be next to a different Arcane Place of Power, or I call it Arcane Place of Power. I mean just Place of Power. You teleport them all around. There's so much technical utility here. I have failed the rolls, I will say. So, like, it is still a spell, and it only goes off when it goes off. But the fact that you can do it in your opponent's turn is so strong. The fact that you can do as many times as you have wizards is so strong. I swear by this spell. I think it's one of the strongest things the army has. And I didn't give it enough credit when I was covering it in the faction focus. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I hope that I did give it enough credit because I thought it was totally insane, and it still is. And the reason why I think it's insane is because Lumineth have had this in their wind lores, in the wind spell lore, and transporting vortex I think was on a 9 Rhine or an 8, and it was one of the things that made sentinel blocks or whatever you want super super strong. Now the fact that this is on a 6, it's super flexible, only within 12, sure, but you can teleport units out of combat, as you said, and the fact that it's unlimited is absolutely insane to me. Combined with all of the redeploying shenanigans that not redeploy as in the commands, but the resetting up of your units that the army already has, you could be looking at a completely different board state after one turn, and I don't mean by, and you don't have to interact with any of your opponent's models to do so.
Yeah,
you could shift your entire army from one side of the board to the other side without much hassle at all, without losing any effectiveness. It's really strong, and I think it's the fact that it's a 6-up and you have an inbuilt +1 to cast on your Eidolon of the Sea, and then you also have the +1s from the Isharan Council if you want to, and from the Font of Power. You could plonk your Eidolon down somewhere, have your opponent march up to him, or try to come into range to him. And if you do feel like he's threatened by an endless spell or something in the future part of the turn, you just teleport him out of there.
Yep.
Gonzos on a 6. Why not?
Yep. It's really strong. Although I've had, this is one of the reasons why I like Isharan Council and Loton so much, is getting any more security that the spell is going to go off. Because if you're relying a battle tactic on it, like taking the terrain piece or getting an objective or whatever, and it fails, you're screwed. So getting those pluses,
there's no rerolls in your army, so
no. And getting those pluses also guarantees that it makes it harder for the opponent to unbind it. So it goes both ways. So anyway. Let's move on to the next one. The next two are easier to go through. So Arcane Corrasion, I haven't found myself using, considering the teleport. Most of my casters are only one casters, but you pick a visible enemy unit within 12, and you subtract 1 from the Ren characteristic of the target's melee weapons until the start of your next turn. It's clearly a strong ability. I just don't know when the right timing is. And it does help with the fact that we largely have 4-up saves, 5-up saves on the Namari. It'll keep your guys alive, but I think it's more of a keep it in your back pocket for the right situation rather than teleporting out of range means you've got unlimited minuses to Ren because they can't reach you, right? So
that's true.
So I'd rather teleport them away, and it's a same casting value. So if this was, I don't know. I think it's totally fine. Problem is, if they're within 12, they're probably within threat range, and there's a part of me that thinks I'd rather it to have a little bit more reach, so that because when's this going off? It's when they're already real close. But if they're outside 12 on their turn, I'm not necessarily hitting them. If they're a fast cavalry, like let's say Dawn Riders, they get 14 and then they get a charge. It's not necessarily guaranteed that I'm going to be able to tag them with it. So it might be once I'm already stuck in combat.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I think it would have been more interesting if you could put it on, or interesting in a different way if you could put it on a friendly unit.
Yes.
Because then it's basically an arcane a mystic shield, sort of.
Yeah.
And that would have made it much more interesting.
Yep. Agreed. Yep. Okay. So Pressure of the Deep. Let's move on to that one real quick. This is a decent spell to have in your back pocket, but it's an I already mentioned it. It's you choose an enemy unit within 18. And it's anti-horde. Roll a dice for each model, and on a 5-up, you do 1 mortal damage. Yeah. So it's great for hordes. It's fantastic for hordes, but we'll have to see what kind of meta we end up chalking up to. A lot of people are talking about big hero and big cavalry blocks.
Cavalry, yeah.
And considering cavalry largely gained an extra point of health per model, I don't know that this is doing enough work to take care of it. But it's great against recursion armies with the hordes and whatever. So it's nice to have in the back pocket. It's also nice for a Hail Mary that if you need to do a mortal wound on something, even if it's just a single model, 1 out of 3 chance of finishing them off. So it could, be that thing in your back pocket, seeing as we don't have Arcane Bolt anymore. So, Jonas, any big thoughts on any of these other than just what we've already said?
Well, as long as Morbid Conjuration has Suffocating Gravetide and nothing changed about how effective Morbid Conjuration is, you're probably never using Pressure of the Deep because the Gravetide does this specific ability and more.
Yep, exactly.
And for a lower spell cost, I think, or is it also on a 7? You've used the bunch, right?
Yeah, I have, but the funny thing is I haven't actually had to think about it too much because I've had so many pluses.
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, even if it's also on a 7, it does more for the same cost or cheaper. So
yeah. Let's see. It goes off on a 7. Yeah,
yep.
There it is.
There you go. Well, having both of those sources on a big blob of 20 Namari or 20 Wardens or whatever you want, that's pretty impactful. But yeah, it's cool that you don't have to select this. It's in your spell lore, sure. You've got plenty of stuff to cast, and being able to cast Steed of Tides with every wizard is already interesting enough.
Yep, and I should mention that there's this weird exception that I haven't really taken too much consideration for, but the Saviors, no, not Saviors of Cinderfall, the Neve Black Talons, her group, has a Idoneth hero, and they have said in the FAQ rules that the Idoneth hero does get to use this spell lore if you take that as your ally option, because it has the right keyword, so it gets to use. So, and that unit is actually really strong.
It's a really good unit, yeah.
And they have teleport stuff built in too. So,
and a super cool unit at that. So
I'm definitely buying it because I play both armies, and you can use it as for order. So anyway, I do think that's an extra little thing that I haven't mentioned yet. That's kind of interesting. Have another cast.
Cool.
Okay. So
Warscroll time.
Okay. Yeah. So I had asked you what you would have added to this because I made this late at night. Is there anything in here? Is there any unit that you really feel like you wanted to add to what we've got here?
Literally 5 of the 6 choices are what I would definitely have put in, and the only thing that I maybe would have wanted to swap out is the Reavers for the other eels, the Ishlian Guard, yeah.
Interesting. I'm curious to hear your reasoning behind that, but I can tell you right now, Reavers are really strong.
Yeah, it's not because it's again as with the Luminate stuff, it's not necessarily that I think that Ishlian Guard are better than Reavers. I just think that Reavers are so obviously strong and it's so clear what they can do that I almost wanted to talk about Ishlian Guard a little bit more because I feel like we were down on them in our faction focus review, and I do feel like they're much more interesting than we thought initially, and that's why I wanted to give him another passover, something like that, maybe.
Yeah, let's do that after we talk about the Reavers.
Sure, cool. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the Eidolon of the Sea and get the started. I could have chosen either one of the Eidolons here. Really, they have different functions. My main reason for not choosing the Storm is because although the 12-inch Holier Than Bubble of +1 to wound and his melee output is better, my problem with him, and I do use him in a number of lists already, I have, is that +1 to wound is only for the riders. If it applied to the mounts, I would be way more interested in him, but it just doesn't. But what is the aspect of the sea bringing? First off, 350 points I think is reasonable. It's a 2-cast wizard with +1 to cast built in. Can't use the Loton buff, by the way, because that's only for Isharan, and can't use the battle formation for the Isharan Council for obvious reasons. His War Scroll spell, or her War Scroll spell, I usually think of it as a she, gives 3 units within 12 inches, -1 to save in combat. You can't stack it. But in the right context, it helps your eels, sharks, turtles, whatever, even thralls, really pierce through some units, considering they all have, well, not all of them, but a chunk of them have buffs for different units. Like the eels all have anti-infantry, and of course, this does impact, and when I say the eels, I mean the riders. This would impact the eels themselves as well, because it's just giving them -1 to save in combat for everything. So they do benefit from that. And it has a rampage that doesn't come in into play a whole lot, as long as you didn't charge. Then you can turn off command usage on a 3+ for 1 enemy unit. So it's basically a roar. The main thing that I think the aspect of the sea is bringing is it's a 2-caster with a buff in a edition where endless spells are extremely powerful. Getting your teleport off is really great. It's fast, it's tanky. It can do a little bit of melee, but mainly you don't want to get in there. Its shooting attack is decent. And as we see why pick this unit, you can take the whole army, excluding the Thrall Master, so it's kind of that War Master type. It's got some mobile spell tech, and it's pretty tanky with a 5-up ward, 3-up save. Jonas, what are you thinking about this caster here?
He was the bane of my existence when we played.
Yeah, you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I could not pin him down. The fact that he has the +1 to cast, thus teleporting on a 5-up, and then with the not the armor of Sitai, but you got the other buff there where I missed on a 1-2-3 to hit. Man, 3-up save, so good. And you know, a lot of spells are kind of close range, and Shackles, for example, is super potent with him because you've got the teleport, and then he can still shackle you wherever, or shackle you and then teleport away. He can do everything. The cool thing is, Ryan, because he's a 2-cast wizard, you can get him wherever you want to with your teleport, and then still benefit from all of your spell tech. Whereas with your other spellcasters, sure, they could teleport themselves, but then they're sitting there because they don't have any spell power left to cast a second spell. So that's why I think he's actually maybe one of the best models or best war scrolls in, well, best model for sure, but one of the best models in the book right now. The best war scroll, sorry.
Yeah, to pull off the other ability that you'd have to do is the other caster teleports the caster that has a spell left over, and then they do it. But you're right. They're a lot more fragile than he is. Though there is definitely tech in teleporting the Soul Scryer closer by because you want to have him let something deep strike right in front of someone. So, but yes, I agree. This guy, lady, whatever, is super great at doing a lot of stuff. And if you can't afford a Lotan in your list, or you're worried about the tankiness, or you need your Isharan heroes to be able to keep up, the Eidolon of the Sea is a great option.
Mm-hmm.
So,
really, just lovely to play with.
Yeah, and the Storm is great, don't get me wrong, but the Storm, I think the Sea offers a little bit more tech, especially with if you don't have any other source of a wizard and you're bringing spell or manifestation lore, this is a platform for making sure those things go off.
Yeah.
So
to be honest, they're cheap enough that you don't necessarily have to choose.
That's true.
You can bring both.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to our Isharan heroes.
Well, you've got the output here. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Definitely. This one I debated putting in here, but so the range is going to be our blue. And for anyone that hasn't seen my charts, we're going from a 6-up save down to a 2, and then EV average is expected value average, which is assuming that all 5 save possibilities are evenly balanced. Mm-hmm. It's a simple metric. But anyway, the range is doing somewhere between 2 and 3 on average, a little over 2, I guess. But the melee base is in orange. That's what it's doing when it's just, fighting any old target. And then the -1 to save is assuming that you got the spell off that she has to reduce their save in combat. But you see that it's not making a huge difference. It's a little bit. It's going from, if you look at expected value average, we're looking at just under 4 to like 4.5. So whatever. It can do some amount of work, but that's not why you're taking it. You're taking it for other reasons. So.
Yep.
And I thought about comparing it to the Eidolon of the Sea, but it's just apples to oranges to me. Like, the Sea is better. I'll just tell you that. It's the like Storm. Double the output.
Storm.
Oh, sorry, the Storm. Yeah, the Storm's better. It's double the output.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now let's get on to the tech pieces. So the Tidecaster is she's changed her function quite a bit, but I still think it's one of the best units we've got. 150 points for 1-cast wizard. Now, it's got a ritual, which used to be a built-in thing for Isharan, but now you've got to take the Tidecaster to bring those rules along, but we've seen that in a lot of armies. Once per turn army, so doubling up's not going to help, you get to roll a die. On a 3-up, you get a strong effect until your next turn. The 3 strong effects are, I'll do from weakest to strongest, I think. You give them all enemy units that during that time period try to retreat, suffer an extra D3 mortal wounds, which is great, but I just haven't seen a whole lot of people retreating a lot.
Yeah.
So that'd be 2D3. I mean, it's definitely punishing them. They just choose not to, so it's more of a deterrent. The next one, depending on who you're playing, this is matchup dependent, but the kind of stable choice is +1 to run and charge for your whole army, which is fantastic, especially considering in Flood Tide, you're getting run and charge free, you know, or run and shoot. So then you're getting an extra inch, which is great. And it's great, especially if you deep strike. So I think that's aesthetically just kind of obviously good. But against the right matchup, the last option makes it so that you're not visible. Your whole army isn't visible for shooting attacks that aren't within 12 inches. Amazing. Like shuts down whole builds. KO really has a hard time with this. Any strong shoot list, especially a ranged one, is going to have a nightmare against this. And considering we lost Forgotten Nightmares, which is the rule that made it so you had to shoot the closest, of course, built in for covering fire now. This combined with that is just you want to get this off every turn to really nuke what their output can be. Which one of those options are you feeling most inclined towards?
I mean, I have the most experience with the best one. I mean, you ranked them in order, the one that ignores shooting outside of 12 inches, because that's just a thing that IDK had in general in their previous edition. So what was it called? Terrors of the Sea or something like that? Deep Sea Terrors?
Forgotten Nightmare. Oh, well.
Forgotten Nightmares. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And it was super potent. Now, I do think that the armies that you called out are indeed quite nerfed by it, though, you know, they have ways to get within range. KO especially does. I do wonder about the Isharan Tidecaster, though. Do you feel like when you include her in your list, Ryan, do you feel like you're almost obliged to take the Isharan Council battle formation?
No, I mean, honestly, the difference, because it's a difference of just 3 up or 2 up. Obviously, that's great. But the deep striking ability of Soulraider Ambushers is so strong that I'm willing to give one of those D6 rolls up. Because remember, it also, her getting her ability off really, though it helps the other thing, you can still land a 9-inch charge somewhere, right? If you need to hit it. It's only making a 1-inch charge difference. And with the Soul Scryer putting you at 7 inches away, which we'll talk about in a second, versus 6, that's a huge difference. So as long as you got a Soul Scryer in the list, I don't think you really need to get the +1 as much, because you're on a base 7 for at least 1 unit if you got a Soul Scryer. So I'm okay with the trade off. I think taking Loton is kind of nice to make sure you get spells off, but then again, Loton's a bit of a tax. So there's trade offs here. Okay. Yeah, and then we talked about why pick this unit. It's extra magic. I said red teleport platform. Because again, like I said, taking multiple small heroes allows you to have more teleport instead of what the sea is bringing, Eidolon of the Sea. The rituals are potentially quite impactful and can easily get up to a +2 or +3 cast if you've got Place of Power, the formation, and Loton in the neighborhood. So a pretty strong center for getting your spells off.
Yeah, pretty good. And also a gorgeous model.
Oh yeah, it's one of the best. I love it. All right, moving on to the Soul Scryer. We've talked a lot about this boy, and the Finger of Doom is back, although the Finger of Doom is not necessarily the main. But God, the Soul Scryer, I wouldn't leave home without anymore.
Nope.
Especially considering you need a wizard. It's a cheap wizard at 120. It's receiving all the -1 to hit buffs and save buffs from being around a boat that everyone else is. It's pretty easy to keep alive, actually, especially considering he can just teleport himself. So what happens is once per turn, one of your units that's in reserve via the Either Sea, which of course was combined with Soul Raid, could be every turn. You could have something still in there. Can deep strike wholly within 12 inch of him instead of a board edge, which is huge already, and then outside of 7 instead of 9, which is fantastic, even just for Reavers that don't want to charge. It's making it with their limited 12-inch range. If they do a redeploy, it means there's a better chance that you still are going to be in target. In range to shoot those things. He's also got a once per turn, your turn, hero phase ability that he can pick a hero that's within 18 inches, and it gives them, I don't know if this goes off automatically, I got to look, but it gives them plus your whole army +1 to wound in combat, if I'm not mistaken. Let me double check that really quick, because I haven't gotten it off. Let's see. Combat attacks, it's on a 3-up, so it's not guaranteed, but it's not a ritual roll. So it's not going to get a buff from the Isharan Council, though you might have thought, since they gave it to almost everyone else's ability, that it would work. But functionally what it's doing is it's acting as a cheap Eidolon of the Storm for you. Because that's what the Eidolon of the Storm is giving, is a +1 to wound bubble. And he's doing it to a hero, and then maybe you send those eels in. That's kind of the Finger of Doom. Go get them, boys. That kind of thing. So anyway, it's got some tech, but it's not his main thing. So why pick this unit? Deep Strike Assist is extremely powerful, especially comboed with the teleport. It makes Soul Raid formation shine, and it's the same magic buffs as the Tycaster, but 30 points cheaper. So what are you thinking?
Yeah, 5 stars. Really, really good. I mean, so good. I don't have words for it, to be honest. It's so flexible. It's so cheap. 120
Yep.
Ryan for all of that. I would
Yep.
almost think that they would have swapped the points with the Tidecaster because the Soulscrider does so much. You could
Yep.
literally take the wizard keyword away from him and it would still be worth 120.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and interestingly, their ability is stackable. So if you had two, you could actually have one on the board already, deep strike the other Soul Scryer Holy Than 12 outside
Oh
of
wow,
7,
that's
and
disgusting.
then have the second Soul Scryer let the other unit come in even further upfield.
Yeah, yeah,
And they're both the same quality of wizard with teleports, and they're cheap. I actually think 2 is a reasonable thing to have in a list, especially if Loton's buffing both of them. So just a great unit.
yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, it comes in the Vanguard box,
It
so
does.
or the Spearhead box. So even more reason to be excited about it. You're getting one when you buy that box. So I wouldn't leave home without it, especially if you're playing Soul Raid
Yep.
Ambushers. So
Amazing, amazing war scroll. I just don't really like the model, but it's so good. The
you
scroll.
don't like the Finger of Doom?
I don't like anything about the Souls Grade. It looks so weird.
All right. Well, yeah, he doesn't like you either. So you're a Lumineth player. All right. Well, all right. So let's move on to our non-tech pieces.
Yeah.
So we've got Morsar Guard. They come in units of 3 for 170, which is kind of what they've always been. Interestingly, they are one of the few cavalry units that didn't, including Dawn Riders, I guess, that didn't lose any move. But they also didn't get a wound to make up for it. So they stayed at 4 health and a 4 up save, which means they're a little bit fragile. The Riders got 2 attacks, hitting on elf profile of 3s and 4s, 1 rend, but 2 versus infantry, 1 damage, but 2 on the charge. And we'll talk about the output in a second. The Eels are 3 attacks each, kind of a normal mount, beast mount profile of 4s and 3s, 1 rend, D3 damage. And the former once per battle charge, mortal damage, is now every charge. So these guys really live up to the always be charging. The problem is 3 of them don't necessarily lift enough stuff to guarantee that you clean a whole unit off the table. And this is where the Ishling conversation maybe comes into play, but we'll talk about it more in a minute. Where Ishling cost 180 points for 3, are tankier, and do have more reliable damage if they're not charging. But if you're talking about going and taking the flanks and having a couple MSU units just floating around doing the thing, I still think maybe Morsar Guard are the right unit. But we'll talk about the output in a second. Why pick this unit? It remained very fast with flying, is great. Its output really skyrockets when paired with Volturnos and the Eidolon of the Storm, and it's best for players good at with surgical strikes and making sure you hit them at the right timing. This is not a unit you want to get stuck into combat. It's just gonna sit there and have a hard time of it. But if you can really, like I was talking about, shoal mentality, where your whole cavalry block moves together, I think you can actually make some good work of this. Maybe I should explain how the mortal wound charge works. So you roll a die per model in this unit after choosing a target enemy unit. Normally on a 4 to 5 that you roll, so you're rolling 3 dice on a MSU unit. You're doing 1 mortal damage, and if you happen to crit on a 6, you're doing D3. If, however, your target unit outnumbers you, so has with the MSU size 4 or more models, but obviously if you get down to 1 guy, this would also be the case for a unit of 2 or more, then you get +1 to that roll. So 3s and 4s do 1 mortal damage, but 5s and 6s do D3, which is really nice. It's like Power of Hishing it, I guess. So they can do quite a lot, but even that I have found overwhelming. That said, considering it's not once per battle anymore that you have to choose when to use it, and it's just every time you get a good charge off, really raises the stonks on this unit if you can time it and get time it just right. And say you stack it with Eidolon the Seas -1 to or -1 save on that unit, then they're getting up to -3 rend on, or I should just say 3 rend against infantry, which can definitely delete some stuff, especially if they get the right buffs off with the other support units. Let's talk about the output real quick, and then let's see what your opinion is on these guys. So the next scroll, our slide here, I've done two different outputs. This is them with only using their War Scroll buffs, and I've scaled it considering what the next slide is going to eventually show when we stack it with the other stuff. So in dark blue is the base output. So you can see if you skip all the way to expected value average, which is usually somewhere around what a 4-up save would be, we're looking at somewhere around like maybe 5.5, 6 wounds that go through with a unit of 3 of these guys. If they're against infantry, it goes up just the slightest bit. So you're seeing not that much of a change. And that's kind of what I wanted to illustrate with this slide. On the charge, though, remember they're getting double damage for the riders and they're getting the mortal wounds off. You can see it gets quite a bit better. So the expected value average in green there goes to something around closer to 9. Which is quite a spike. It's about a 50% improvement. And then against infantry, we do see a bit better of improvement because now they're doing 2 damage on that profile that has 2 ren. So getting closer to about a 10 damage. So that's what we're looking at with no outside buffs, and I'm not attack or using priority target or anything like that. Let's go to the next slide to see what happens if we use some extra buffs. Oh, the image moved a little bit. We've got here, and this is the same scale. So if they're not charging, but they're using both the Volturnos +1 to hit for the riders and the Eidolon of the Storms +1 to wound for the riders, now we're seeing that even without charging, we're looking at expected value average of about maybe 8 or so. That's a little bit of a buff, but they really need to be charging. So then we're seeing that we're spiking on the charge to something around maybe 12.5, 13 damage for just a unit of 3 of these guys. Or if we look at green, Volturnos has a once per game ability to give 3 units holier than 12-inch of him +1 attack, which works better on the Morsar Guard than the Ishlian because it's a 50% performance improvement rather than a 33% performance improvement based on how many attacks they had. And so if you've got some Morsar Guard that are receiving this buff, now Volturnos can't give it to himself. He has to choose 3 other units. It works best on these eels. Then they're spiking, and now I'm including all the other buffs plus the charge. They're spiking up to around, I guess that's about maybe 15-ish damage, just a unit of 3 of these. And obviously, if you took a max size of 6, you're doing quite a lot. Now, the question I have for you, Jonas, is how do you think these damage outputs are stacking against a block of, say, MSU Dawn Riders to compare them? They're cheaper than Dawn Riders at 130 for 3, whereas the Dawn Riders are 210, I think, for 5.
Yeah.
But the output on the Dawn Riders with all buffs is quite much a good bit higher than this, right?
Yeah, the thing is, Seek and I I think you were there. We also did it for the index review. We put all of these cavalry-esque, well, not cavalry-esque, just cavalry models that were similar. The Spite Rider Lancers, Achillean Morsar Guards, the Dawn Riders, the Chaos Knights next to each other. And I do feel like these guys hit appropriately for their points costs. They are less effective than Dawn Riders, but Dawn Riders are also a fair bit more expensive. So it's you have to consider what you get from and for this, right? With Dawn Riders, you're paying 420, which is a big chunk of points for a unit that will delete anything, but really requires a lot of buffs to do so as well. I think this unit does pretty well on its own, actually. I wouldn't necessarily invest too many resources in it because I just don't see difference being high enough for the things that you get, because the Volturnos buff is nice, but doesn't affect the mounts, does it?
No, that might have been in here too. I'm going to double check that real quick while you're talking, but I think I put the beastmasters in there too. So they got +1 attack on the, which you could also get without Volturnos by just doing all attack on the unit.
Yeah.
And then it would affect both sides.
Yeah, anyway, I do feel that they inflict enough damage for their points cost. Would I have been more interested in them if they were a little bit more expensive and thus also dealt more damage? I think so, because I really want this unit, especially if you're taking 6 to delete something. As you mentioned, you want to hit something really hard and then teleport away. A little bit like, or move away, a little bit like Sylvaneth did or does, I guess. So I do think this unit would be better with a little bit more damage and then also a point increase. But as they are now, they're also pretty fine.
Yeah, my experience thus far is that and this is just a fourth edition comment too, with a profile getting less reliable, less threes and threes in the game. They've got fours in that profile on both the eels and the riders in different places.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not getting the other buffs, the external buffs, a lot of times they just whiff. And
Okay.
you can't afford to have these guys not charging.
Yeah, that's
Getting
true.
stuck in combat is rough.
Yeah.
Now I will say, and it just occurred to me to mention that this is a great one advantage to having 4 wounds on these guys instead of 3 is that they out wounds count or health count. A lot of cavalry units, which means they can power
Power
through,
through. Yeah.
and then they fly 14 inches and go take another objective or go get near your castle or whatever they need to be to get out of there. So I would keep a power through on deck for these guys to keep them out of combat, and then they're sitting in a better chance to be able to charge again. So I think keep that CP on deck for these guys to keep them alive. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty cool unit
So
still.
yeah, it's they definitely benefit from the buffs better than the Ishlian do. Though, like I said, the Ishlian have one extra attack and aren't dependent on being on the charge to get their main functionality. They get better defensively on the charge for a 5-up ward, which is kind of a good segue. We're about to talk about the Reavers, and I know you wanted to talk about the Ishlian in contrast to the Reavers. So let's
Well, in
keep that
contrast to
on.
the Morser Guard, mostly.
Oh, okay, sure. You were going to use them instead of the Reavers. So
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
let's talk about them now. What is it? What is your argument for the Ishlian guard?
Well, I
Or
remember us talking about them in the faction focus, and then we were really down on them because they just did not do the same thing that they did before. They weren't as tanky. They didn't get their nice save anymore. But I do feel like they still serve a pretty big purpose. They're pretty cheap, and where Morsar Guard are really good in groups of 6. I think that Ishlain really shine in groups of 3 to pin down a small unit because you just cannot be everywhere with IDK. And then having a eel unit with 12 wounds just soaking up some damage with the 5-up ward is pretty nice, especially considering that there's so little access to ward saves in this army. I think it's only the Leviathan, isn't it? Well, and the Eidolons have it for free, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was just wondering what your opinion was on that mostly. What are your how do you compare those two eel units in your head? How would you run them?
Okay, so they're 10 points more expensive, and that's my main problem.
Yeah.
If they were the same price, I could see maybe mixing and matching a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
You have to charge to get that 5-up ward off, which feels
Yeah.
counter to what the Morsar want to be charging, and I'd rather the Ishlian they lost their unrendable, and I don't want to compare things, but I would maybe keep the 5-up ward but put them on a 3-up save. I'd be much more interested. They do have an ability that goes off on a 3-up that you pick an enemy unit in combat and subtract 1 from the attacks characteristic. Super strong. But going off on a 3-up is
Yeah.
it's a strong ability, don't get me wrong. But like I don't know exactly how they are gonna. They are better if they get stuck in combat. Like I almost would say give them a 3-up save and a 5-up ward only on the charge, 4-up save still, but then they get a 6-up base save that's always on, even if they don't charge a ward. I mean, and then a 5-up on the charge, or I don't know, something to keep them alive a little longer. But I do like that they still maintain some of their output. It's better than the Morsar Guard if they get stuck in combat, but it's not like so much better that you're like, oh my god, it's 10 points better.
Yeah.
The -1 to damage is great, but then if it's only our -1 attack, I mean, but then it's only really having an impact 2/3 of the time. And so I don't know. I think they're still good. I need to experiment with them a little bit more, but they're not going to necessarily clean a unit out, even just sitting in combat.
Yeah.
They and then they're not getting power through either. So because they probably didn't charge.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about them. But I'm not as down on them as I once was. Put it that way. So I'm with you on that page.
Okay, let's move on to the Reavers then.
Yeah, I think one of the strongest regular output units we have in the book.
For sure.
So you block a 10, 130 points, 7-inch move, 12-inch range with run and shoot gives you, without using the +1 to run from the Tidecaster, a max 25-inch threat range. And keep in mind, the Tidecaster's buff wouldn't be applied if you used an auto run, so you'd have to roll a hard 7 or a hard 6 to get the 7-inch. So I actually think it's more likely you just use an auto run if you really want the range. They are a fantastic target for Soul Raid ambushers or using the Soul Scar Andor.
Yes.
For the reasons we've already named. And also, for that reason, I think there's some utility in not bringing a unit of 20 because it's harder to get them fully around a terrain piece with a block of 20 on a 32 mil bases. Um, their shooting profile is 2 attacks, 3s, 4s, 1 rend, 1 damage. I should have put a D after that, but it's auto wounding, so it raises the effectiveness to basically like rolling a 2 up on a die per model. They're going to do 1 wound. That's one way you could look at it per model, except for the champ. You're on a 2 up. They do. That's their output that you're looking at. But they're a huge, like super great option for priority target, which I mentioned later. But you take a big old block of 20 of them, and if it's really going to depend on the meta, how many units they're putting in their general's regiment. But remember, with the deep strike, you might actually be able to pick and choose that you're at least shooting at their general. With 41 shots with a block of 20 that are going to be sitting on 2s and 3s, 1 rend auto wounding. I'll be honest, the auto wounding hasn't impressed me a lot, but especially with covering fire, which reduces their to hit, I think it does have a bit more impact. I also mentioned here that they can retreat and shoot, but they'll still be taking damage except in Battle Round 4 for Ebtide, when the whole army gets to do that without taking damage. And then why pick this unit? Amazing deep strike / priority target option. They're good in both 10s and 20s. Consider a Soul Raid formation and or pairing with a wizard to shoot and fade, my reference to the Sylvaneth players, where basically what you can do is you move your Soul Scryer up. You kind of measure what you need. You know that he can drop them in from deep strike, from cover or reserve, holier than 12, but outside 7. And then because they're implicitly holier than 12, then you can use a magical intervention in the opponent's turn to teleport them outside of not even being hittable, which is great for being in your general's regiment. And then put them around some terrain feature so that they're either ready for something else, take an objective, or put them back in the sky, in the sea, I should say, for another turn. There's so much tech with these guys in combo with a Soul Scryer, and even being set up holier than 9 inches of board edge can steal some objectives because they're close. They're close enough to be able to put at least a foot on. So let's take a look at their output, and then I want to get your opinion on these guys. This is 10 Reavers. So we're looking at, I did all the covering fire, so I've got them ranked from. So their base profile, without being in priority target, with covering fire, is still doing an expected value of around 5 wounds against all the saves averaged out, which is not bad for a covering fire for 10. And obviously you can do a little more than doubling that for a block of 20. That's not bad against all saves averaged. Then we look at the orange as the base profile. So that jumps up to, for 10 models, just under 6. Then covering fire with priority target, on average, is pumping them up to about 7 for 10. And then priority target without covering fire, so when you're getting on 3s, is bumping them up to about 9. Well, maybe 8.5. 8.5 for 10, which if you take them in a block of 20, then we're looking at 17. Now, their main weakness is their 12-inch range, but they make up for it with the run and shoot and then all the deep strike shenanigans. How are you thinking about these guys compared to Sentinels right now?
I think about them in a very similar way, Ryan, because their weapon profile is exactly the same. The only difference is that these guys have a shorter range.
Yeah.
But they obviously have more movement shenanigans and teleport shenanigans. So yeah, I think they're very, very good. Great unit. And as you mentioned, fantastic in both 10 and 20s, which is very nice.
Yeah, and they're great for if you don't have eels in your list and you want to take some guys to go get the flanks. These guys are running and shooting, so they might actually be able to get over there and still do something.
Yeah, I actually think these pair super well with the eels. You play 2 blocks of 10, and then you chip down some units, and then your big eel unit is gonna probably finish off what they left for the fishes. So yeah.
Also good with the sharks, though I'm not a huge fan of the sharks for getting that feeding frenzy type thing off that they have.
Fair.
So that's a good point. Chit damaging some stuff. Okay. Do you have anything else you want to say about the Reavers?
No, you mentioned it all. It's just very, very good.
Solid unit.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said beforehand or at some point that you thought they were actually almost so obviously good that it wasn't worth talking about. But I totally get that. But I think they're just a must-take unit
Yeah,
for a
it's
number of
just their
builds.
range profile is so similar to Snakes and Sentinels that I almost felt like we're talking about just generic range units after a while. But I'm very happy that you include them still. So
Cool. I've got a bit of a wild card for my last one, so
yeah.
that'd be Volturnos. I actually think Volturnos is pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that he's necessarily an auto take. It depends on what you're doing. His maybe biggest downside is that he's a war master, which means he has to be in your general's regiment,
Yeah.
which means he's a kind of a like got a target on him the whole time. But at 70 points more than the king, he's got a lot of viability. He's got a 12-inch move, 8 health, 3 up save. So if you you can't put any of those artifacts or heroic traits on him, so you're not keeping him live per se with like what's going on with the other stuff in the army. But you could put him around a boat for +1 save. You could put him around a turtle, which the turtle is a bit expensive for what he does, but then he's got a 5-up ward. And he's got a built-in 3-up ward versus spell, prayer, and manifestation mortal damage. I had used it wrong in our game as a spell ignore because it used to be a spell ignore. But in any case, it still was a 3 for
Mm-hmm.
every one of the lanes that
Mm-hmm.
comes through. So I think it could have also had an impact. But he's giving a holier than 12-inch bubble at +1 to hit for all of the Acalian riders. That's mainly going to impact the eels because of how weight of dice work and their points efficiency, but it's also impacting the riders on the shark and the turtle, which are okay, but it's not the reason you're taking those units. That's not where their main output is coming from. He's also got the, as previously mentioned, once per battle +1 attack in combat for 3 IDK units holier than 12. This works really well on thralls.
Yep.
So even though thralls are glass cannony, it's basically 50% extra output for those units, which is clearly strong, especially considering they've got 2 rend against infantry or against monsters are 2 damage. It could do a lot of work. The thing is, you've got to time it right. You got to keep them all within the 12-inch bubble. You got to make sure they're there. Now, granted, a big block of 20 will probably get all 20 of them in 3-inch combat range. But it's not just the thralls that are benefiting. Even reavers aren't in a pinch that bad because they're on 1 attack, 3s, 4s, no rend 1. But if you're doubling the output on that, and let's say the what's it called? The Eidolon of the Sea gave a unit -1 rend or -1 save in combat, then you're actually doing some work because it's just a weighted dice game at that point.
Yeah. Or the storm is giving +1 to wounds.
Sure. Then they're on 3s,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you got the both stacked. Who knows? You could have the Soul Scryer doing it on a hero and giving it +1 to wound as well. There's some subtle combos that are going on in there. And so he's functionally good for any build that wants to once per game get +1 attack, obviously preferably in high tide when you're striking first.
Yeah.
So I said, why pick this unit? Solid output, especially on the charge, which we'll see later. Extremely buffy for all Eels builds. Even as his place in Namari list with once per battle. Consider keeping him near your hero with the cavalry here, the morsels thing. Yeah. And he can take the whole army, including both of the 2 Italics heroes, which would be the Kalian Thrallmaster as a Italics hero, or Loton, and/or actually. You could take both, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, what are your thoughts on him before we look at the output?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are tied to the output, so maybe let's do that first.
Yeah, and I said and/or. It's not and/or. It's one or the other.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the output. So this is his war scroll only, just like I did with the guard, where he's only looking at his own buffs. And keep in mind, he can't give himself +1 attack or +1 to hit, but he doesn't need it. Well, he could use the +1 attack, but his expected value average just on base without charging is around 7 damage against all saves. But on the charge, he's hitting about 10, which is again only using his war scroll, which is considerably better than the king, because he's on this guy's on 6 attacks, 2s, 3s, -2, and 2 damage, but 3 on the charge, which is nothing to sneeze at. Like he can actually punch a hole in some stuff, and he's done some good work for me thus far.
Mm-hmm.
6 attacks with 3 damage on 2s and 3s is pretty good. And then if he's getting the Eidolon of the Storms +1 to wound, we're looking at as good of a profile as you get without taking rerolls or crit 2 hits, or crit mortals or anything. So I mean, like, pretty solid profile in the charge. Let's take a look at what he's looking like with the other buffs. So that'll be the next slide. Yep, this is with all the external buffs. So that would be beastmasters for +1 on his mounts to hit. You could also just accomplish that with alt attack again. And then the Eidolon buff, which could also be exchangeable against heroes with the Soulraider finger pointing. But we're looking at, with just beastmasters, is the lowest output there, but that's pushing him, and this is assuming charging, to above 10. Then with just the Eidolon, not beastmasters, we're looking at just under 12. And then if you're getting to both, on average, we're looking at just above 12. That's charging, and you've got 2 static buffs that are actually pretty easy to get. Or you could have, again, done all-out attack on the guy. And keeping in mind that you probably have strike first if you're going in on this stuff. And in combo, like I said, with the shoal kind of mentality, you're having him attack and having all your other dudes strike first. You're getting quite a bit of output, and he's only 270 points. So maybe you'd compare him to someone like what's he called again? The Eltharion. How's he looking compared to all the guys that your beat stick kind of like heroes that are about 270 points in the Lumineth roster?
Yeah, so with the buffs, he's a little bit better than Altharion against the 2-up save, for example. But I really like Volturnos. He's very killy. He's basically what you wanted from the Beatstick King from 3rd edition. I think if you like that playstyle, you'll go for Volturnos nowadays. I love the idea of him running around with maybe even 14 Namarti thralls, then a couple of eels, hit your opponent in the face in turn 2 with his once per battle buff, and then moving on to turn 3, you get all of those units at a strike first thingy as well, and with him being, you could be super aggressive with him, and with the right build, with a couple of eels and a bunch of thralls, I could really see value in the first battle formation that we talked about, the Namari, what's it called? The one that gives you a reroll to charges and runs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could see him being a facilitator for the turn 2 punch and into the turn 3 for always strike first round. But yeah, the fact that he can buff all units is very cool to me, because that really emphasizes once again what 4th edition wants you to do, and he wants to bring a multitude of different units, right? Just, you can go all eels if you want to, you can go all thralls or Namarti if you want to, but a mix of both still works very fine, and I do think he emphasized that in a nice way. Definitely.
Yeah, I'm glad you like him. I think for 270 he's actually really reasonable.
He is. It's a cool model. It's just it's a bummer that we've once again have reached that point where the GHB is about generals, and you don't want your generals to be your general.
Yeah, fair. Lotan is not a war master, so there's a part. Well, no, then he'd be more fragile, but you could just teleport him around and keep him away from people.
Yeah.
If you absolutely had to. But Volturnos needs to go in.
Yeah, and he has no ward save unless it's magic damage.
Yeah, or you got the turtle with him, which is why when we played, I had the turtle going. But
I'm just not completely convinced that the turtle is worth it, even for the 5-up wards.
If he was 400 points, I would say yes.
Yeah.
But 500 points, I'm a little iffy, because his output is very dependent on getting certain things, and the shooting attack is also swingy. I want to say really quick about the king, the generic king, that the main use for him, his output is weaker, but if he's got a thing where he can bring an eels unit and not cav, he's fought, even if they didn't charge, but of course you do want to charge. If you had a big block of Morisar guard and him, and you get the charge off with both of them, he fights and then they fight, and you say you're not in your strike first turn, it's a really good way to do what you were just talking about in the second battle round, to guarantee that they're free to keep to be able to charge next time around. And it's more guaranteed that what happens if the Morisar guard just can't pull it off on their own. That's my main reason for thinking the king is a good option there. Plus, considering if you can't afford an Eidolon, he can bring any of the Acalian units with him, or any Idoneth. Actually, he's one of those types, the War Master types, and he's 70 points cheaper than Volturnos. So and he could take the command trade and artifact. So I think there might be a place for him, but he's just less flashy and doesn't give the +1 to hit bonus and all the other stuff that Volturnos brings for your army. So. I've got mixed feelings about him, but I think there's a version of reality where you punch to guarantee that you clear the unit so that you can move on and be free of charge to charge later. So
yeah. I mean, you could even, if you don't care about how many drops you have, you could. It's actually pretty cheap. 200 points is kind of fine. He's a little bit underwhelming in some aspects because he's only there for damage, but 200 points is not a lot. So you could run a couple of them with an Eidolon of the Storm and just go nuts.
Oh yeah, he's the best option for Hero Hammer in the game. You bring a Volturnos plus a bunch of kings, and then let's say Volturnos, 3 kings and a storm, and then and maybe a turtle. You're just doing some work.
Yeah. That would be so cool though, that army. That would look amazing.
Yeah, it'd be cool. Okay, so we're done with the War Scrolls. Let's take a look at pitch battle profiles. Okay, so I'm going to summarize this in a second, but for those of you that haven't seen this, you got the heroes in like the pinkish color, and then down below you've got the non-hero units that could be taken in their regiments. I'm going to summarize it in real quick, but let's just take a look at some obvious things. You've got 2 different. If you look at the blue section, you got 2 different types of units. You got Namari, which is down below, foot troops, and then the rest is just your Acalian stuff, which are either cavalry or, in the case of the Leviathan, a monster. And you've got above 2 different italics heroes. Those would be your Thrall Master, which can only be taken in the regiments of the 2 kings. And then you've got the Loton, which of course is unique, so it can only be taken once anyway, but can be taken with either the kings in their regiments or with the Eidolons and Isharan. So kind of your like priest wizard cast.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're looking at. And Loton is also a War Master type in the sense that he can take everything. He just can't take a hero in his unit. But I think he's better used. I guess he's a cheap version of that. If you can't take an Eidolon to be able to take any like of the cavalry, let's say you want to take mainly foot hero people and no kings or Volturnos and no Eidolons, but you want to take Loton, that's the way you can squeeze some eels or sharks or whatever without taking Aux unit. So he's got some utility as being a regiment leader at that function. But let's take a look at the next slide to see how it breaks down in the way that I've kind of done it based on my battle profiles thing. So unlimited units that can be taken by any of your heroes would be Thralls and Reavers, because Namari fall under that banner. Italics heroes I already mentioned, but Loton can be taken by all heroes except the Thrall Master, and the Thrall Master is an Italics hero that can only be taken by the 2 kings. War Master types, again, for lack of a better term, only Volturnos for clarity's sake here is a true War Master, but the kind that can take any troops are the 2 kings, the 2 Eidolons, and then Loton can take all Idoneth, plus the 0-1 Italics heroes, as I mentioned above. Your restricted units, you don't have any, like you guys had in Lumineth with River Blades. Nope. There are none. If a unit can be taken by a hero, it can be taken freely, as in up to as many slots as they have. And then any Namari is the only other restriction we have, which is basically all the Isharan, 3 of them, which would be the Soulraider, Soul Scryer, and Tidecaster, but not Loton. And so that's it. How flexible do you see this in contrast to what you covered in depth with the Lumineth?
I mean, you could basically do whatever you wanted, right? With these battle profiles. I do think it's maybe a little bit too flexible in the sense that it almost doesn't matter anymore what the rules are now for building your lists, except for the regiment stuff. You can just take whatever you want. What I love about the battle profiles here, and it's something that I really expected for Lumineth as well, but we didn't get it, is that your wizard cast, let's call it that, can be like an emissary to a melee unit, and I really expected, just as you guys got with the Isharan, that our Sonari heroes would also be able to slot it in for, let's say, a Venari Lord Regent, for example. So I love that aspect of the IDK battle profiles. I do think it's maybe a little bit too flexible not that I want them to be punished or in any way or shape or form, but mostly it's now so flexible that the list building restrictions almost don't matter anymore.
Well, as you'll see with my list, to be fair, the Isharan support tech heroes, except for Lotan, have to take their whole regiment if you don't want to add Oxes. So it's not like, I think what you were kind of saying is you want to be able to take us, Regent, or some other hero, right? So that they don't eat up another regiment. We can't do that either, except for Lotan. And Lotan doesn't count as a caster. If he was a caster, I'd be much more convinced that that was strong. But he's unfortunately just kind of buffing the control scores.
That's fair.
So I don't know it's as strong as it sounds. But
no, I've totally generalized it from going from Lotan and just equalizing him with Isharan.
Yeah. I think if I've got quite a bit of drops in my list. I feel like Idoneth needs to have quite a few in order to get all of the tech pieces in play.
Yeah.
So
Okay, shall we look at the lists?
Yes, please. So I actually have played 3 different lists at this point, but I'm gonna start with my second list. The first list is the one you experienced, which was the all Acalian kind of build with the beastmasters. But then I switched to the Isharan Council, and I had both Eidolons in this list. I had mixed success with it, but I think I still need to kind of like play around with it. It's Isharan Council, as I just mentioned. It's got Lore of the Deeps, because of course it does, and every list I've ever made thus far has Morbid Conjuration, because I think it's just too good. So the idea of the list is to use all of those different hero buffs. So I've got a Soul Render in here. I've got a Thrall. Well, I do have a Thrall Master, but he doesn't benefit from it. I got a Soul Render. I've got Tidecaster. I got Lotan, and I didn't actually take a Soul Scryer in this one, but he doesn't benefit from the thing. It's the Tidecaster, and then the Soul Scryer would in the sense that he's a caster. But anyway, so the General's Regiment is maybe not the right place to start, because sometimes you're thinking about keeping that stuff alive. But it is a decent place to start. It's the Eidolon of the Storm, even though I do have another Eidolon somewhere else. But I felt like the Storm is a little bit more reliably wanting to use Ancient Pride, which is doesn't hit on 1s, 2s, or 3s. And then the Dritch Leech, which is the -1 to cast, because he wants to go in and kind of be in the midst of it, and giving that +1 to wound buff out on all the thralls especially. So he's trying to get up in the middle of the action, whereas the C is kind of hanging back a little bit further. Also in the General's Regiment, just for priority target sake, is the Reavers big block. Now, I can not deep strike them with I don't have a Soul Square in this list, so I can't do that outside of 7. They can only come in with the board's edge. So that's a bit restrictive, but I do have a Soul Render in the list to help bring them back. So that's that one regiment right there. The second regiment is, I guess, the one that I was actually actively using as the Deep Strike unit, which is to have a small unit of Reavers, small unit of Thralls, and then a Thrall Master who is giving, we haven't talked about him, but he's giving a Holy Than 12-inch bubble for himself and all Namari units of crit 2 hits in combat, and it goes off automatically, which is nice, or -1 to wound, if I'm not mistaken, in combat. Which is good, keeping them alive. But what I was really doing with him is deep striking him in the main side of where my big blocks were, and then letting the other 2 units deep strike into the sides to set me up for a take the flanks and or grabbing objectives to have like a threat piece in the back. That's kind of what I was doing with that unit more often than not. The third regiment is just a Soul Render to help keep bringing back all of my units. And remember, he's getting auto bringing back 3 different Namari units within Holy Than 12 at the end of any turn, including the opponent's turn. So it's helped keeping those blocks around. Then he's kind of coming in with a block of 20 Thralls. I've got an Eidolon of the Sea for reasons we've already discussed. So I've got the double Eidolon thing, the best of both worlds. And then a Tidecaster in the 5th regiment with Lotan as his Talix hero. And so what we're looking at here is the Eidolon C is 2 casts with a +1 to cast. We got the Tidecaster with +1 from Lotan, but also +1 from the faction, so +2 to cast. Then we've got the Soul Render basically getting his ability off all the time. We've got Lotan projecting a Holy Than 12-inch bubble of +3 to control scores for all the units, including the small heroes. So putting the small heroes basically on 5 control score. And Lotan's getting 5 himself. Then he's giving all of the Reavers and Thralls, which don't have a banner, if I'm not mistaken, they just have the champ. it looks like a banner, but it's just the champ.
Yeah.
Then they're getting up a +3 to their control scores. So and then even if I'm not mistaken, all the Idoneth units are benefiting. So if the Eidolon's around, they're bumped up to 8, which is pretty strong for what Lotan's bringing. And you just, of course, are talking about castling up a bit. Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. It's all Idoneth units, wholly than 12 of him. So it's adding a lot of control value in a list that already doesn't have a problem with control scores because it's kind of a weight of bodies kind of list. Anyway, it's got some tech. There's a lot of resurrection here that's potential. And remember, I could teleport that soul render to another location if he needs to go resurrect something, if necessary. Same thing with the Thrall Master. Teleport a big block of any of those units. The Storm is doing what he wants to do, buffing all those guys. The Reavers, there's plenty of Reavers to go around, 30 in total and 30 Thralls. So there's lots of kind of like bodies and tech here. But I don't like it as much as the next list we'll be talking about. But what are your thoughts about this list?
I like it a lot. It's super cool. I do think it's a little bit too heavy on the small heroes. I keep thinking like, which hero would I drop? You definitely need the Thrall Master. The Soul Render is obviously very strong. The Tidecaster makes your army survivable against shooting because that's gonna be its biggest weakness in the first couple of turns, I think. So I keep returning to low 10 and thinking maybe another 10 Thralls to upgrade the other Thralls unit to 20 is more interesting. I don't know. I would personally just be inclined to drop a hero somewhere, but I don't know. I don't necessarily know which one I would drop.
You know, the funny thing is, I might actually say you should drop the Eidolon of the Sea, because
Yeah.
that's all you've got a caster already with, and then maybe put a Soul Scryer in there instead, and then figure out what to do with the points that you got. Because then you'd get two. You would functionally you'd be going from 3 casts at +1 or +2 to 2 casts at guaranteed +2 each. And then you've got room for also the deep strike ability, and then you've got room for bringing in another unit of, say, eels to do something or whatever.
You could actually swap the Eidolon of the Sea for Volturnos and then have enough points left over to increase your Thralls unit from 10 to 20.
Yep.
And then you could buff both Thrall units of 20 with Volturnos.
Yeah, the reason I started working with this was just because I thought the sea was so invaluable for getting those endless spells out. But
but you've got so many casters already, right? Well, 2
only
only, but it seems more, but it's only 2, I guess.
Well, it's just the Tidecaster. So
the Soulraider also is not a wizard.
No. So and the Thrall Master is just there to boost the output of the leaning. So I feel like only having one caster. If you get rid of the sea, you need to put a Soul Scryer in. But yeah. And there you have 2 teleports still, which, doesn't change the situation. And he's even better at casting as long as he's standing around one of the other ones. Yeah. And remember, for the Isharan buff, the Soul Render, even though he's not a caster, and Lotan, even though he's not a caster, count as Isharan units for buffing the other one. So as long as they're standing within 3 of each other, then they're projecting that bubble. So, or the buffs, I mean.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's definitely some things to move around. I agree with out could be a thing, but I think the Storm is kind of necessary to make the Reavers tick.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you need a Storm.
So okay, let's move on to the other list. This is actually written by a buddy, Pater, who also runs the Bloodstorm events here. I did tweak it, so that's why I felt like it was okay to put my name. Sent a list over, and then I swapped some things in, like Morbid Conjuration instead of Either Rot Machineries, which I think he was mainly using cogs to help get up field for reroll charges. And then there were some other things I moved around, but basically it started with him for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, this list is built around using the Soul Raid ambushers thing, which I think is really cool. And then it's got basically, if we just look at the heroes that are in the units, we've got Volturnos for running the big block of eels that I've got. I've got a bunch of eels. And we've also got Eidolon of the Storm for similar reason. Then we've got a Soul Scryer for the Deep Strike, which is very necessary, I think, in a Soul Raid ambushers list. And Tidecaster for another caster. plus to get those endless spells out, because I don't have an Eidolon of the Sea here. So we got 2 casters that are only getting pluses if they're standing around a place of power. So that's kind of important. But we've got in our general's regiment a block of 20 reavers, usually going for priority target for the +1 to hit and wound against stuff in the general's regiment. And then a big block of Morsar Guard, which is also for tankiness reasons, to make sure that the things in your general's regiments are less likely to die. Keep in mind, those 20 reavers have enough wounds absorption to not just die to a swift breeze. You can also teleport them away and be healing them. They can retreat and still shoot, of course, taking some damage. And then, of course, you could put them in the Soulraider ambushes. Once they get down to a smaller unit, they're easier to put around wholly within 3 inches of a terrain piece to put them back in the reserve so that they're not a target anymore. And they're a good rally target, by the way. And then in the second regiment, you got the Eidolon Store, again with the Ancient Pride for making to hit rolls in combat fail on 1, 2, 3. And Delicious Morsels, like I said, to be healing up Volturnos and all of your eels. And then also 3 units of 3 Morsar Guard, and starting 2 on the edges to go take the flanks and then pull them back towards the middle.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then have 1 that maybe is in the middle. And then always hugging terrain so that you always have threat pieces to put back into the either sea. And then the Tidecaster and Soulscryer do what you'd assume from everything that we've talked about thus far. It still has a relatively high health count of 110 and 39 models. It's light on that, but we should have talked about maybe I'll add these to the future one, but how many points they count on objectives. But it's maybe more than you'd think. But you're still fighting for objective control in this list. But this list I think is the stronger of the two, and is much more precise scalpel kind of usage. And honestly, in my last few games, I've just been staying away from people more often than not, because I know how much those Morsar Guard will fail to do what they need to do if they can't lift a whole unit. So you got to be picky and choose your fights and try to really just be all about objective control on the board and being real careful about what you set in Deep Strike. So what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, you asked me whether I wanted to include my list that I've built this last couple of days, but it's very similar to this one, so I like it a lot, what I'm seeing here. It might actually be much better than mine as well. I had dropped 2 of the small Morsar Guard units in favor of 1 big Namari Thralls units. Yeah. And I think I had an Eidolon of the Sea instead of the Storm, something like that. But I love this. It's very cool. Oh, I did split up the Reavers. That's what I did. Yeah, I split up the Reavers in 2 units of 10 to play on the flanks and all that stuff.
Yeah, the 20, especially if it's in your general's regiment, obviously makes for a better priority target option, but also keeps them alive a little bit better. 10's real easy to lift, and that was what I was scared of. But yeah, the Soul Raid, I can't say it enough. The Deep Strike mechanic with the Soul Square is just incredibly powerful. So yeah. Anyway, so that's what I've got on this. We've got a last slide talking about closing thoughts.
Yeah,
I believe.
Let's do it.
So internal and external balance. How about you lead this one, and then I'll throw my thoughts in. But what are you thinking about what you know of the meta right now? Obviously,
it's very early days.
What you know of the Lumineth, you know that very well, of course. And then internal balance with this book. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I think if you're an IDK player, you should probably be quite happy with your index. It looks like all of your units or most of your units are useful. You have a small roster, not the smallest, but your list of normal units that you can choose from is quite slim. And I'm very happy to see that all units are kind of useful. As you mentioned, the Leviathans may be a little bit overpriced, and the Sharks, since they can't be reinforced anymore now, might be a little bit iffy at times. But at the same time, I like the fact that you can build your army as a mix of all of those things now. You don't have to go full Shark. You don't have to go full Namari. It's perfectly fine to have one Shark for the reducing charge rolls ability. Slap some Namari in there, slap some Achillean units in there, and it'll work. It'll still be pretty fun to play with and decent, I think. So I love the fact that you have a lot of flexibility. We've seen two very different lists from you, and I made some suggestions that for things that I would change, not necessarily for the better, but it just goes to show that someone that doesn't necessarily play IDK could still swap things around without it losing too much of its touch, I hope. So
Yeah.
I think you could be so happy that whatever your collection entails, you can bring it now and it feels fine. There's some very cool power combos going around, but there's also a lot of pieces that can do perfectly well on its own, and that's the fun of the game for me. The fact that you have some pieces like the Island of the Sea with the correct heroic trait or artifact can just really go off on it, then do its own thing. Whereas you also have some units that want synergy with other units, so you have that in tandem, which is really cool. So that's that for internal balance. Will you agree?
Yeah, 100%. Everything you said. I when the third edition Battletome came out, I was pretty hyped at first, but then the meta shaped so quickly around the Slap King that I felt like you couldn't choose any heroes but the Slap King. Like it became that was the way to play. And then it kind of warped around sharks as well. And I just didn't understand, like, it didn't feel very internally balanced at all at the
Yeah.
end. And then especially when kind of segueing into external, and then I want you to say what you're thinking. But the third edition book was it just didn't have enough juice to fight with the rest of save stat and the other crazy mortal wounds that existed in the game. By the time third edition evolved into in recursion, it just couldn't keep up. And maybe it was okay at the beginning, but it didn't last very long. So I'm hoping that we have enough movement shenanigan tech to always be relevant. And that's kind of my thought on that. What are you thinking?
I think it plays as it should play. It's an elf army. It's fragile. It hits properly, and for your fragility, you need to get something in return. And you got a shit ton of movement and teleports. And as someone who loves the teleporting aspect of the game and the movement shenanigans, I mean, it's what's drawing me to Idoneth even more than before. But I completely agree with everything that you said before as well, that it just seemed like sharks were the way to go, and I don't necessarily like running a bunch of the same units. So yeah, it looks very good. Just be really happy with your index so far. As far as impact on the meta, if you're fine with continuing to that bullet point,
Yeah, for sure.
obviously it's super early. You're seeing some graphs now from a couple of GTs that really show a skewed result. I would strongly discourage everyone to give too much value to those early charts, because it just shapes your opinion of a meta that doesn't necessarily exist yet. And by shaping your opinion, you're helping it exist. So please don't. But I think IDK sits in a very nice middle spot. I don't really see GW changing all that much, to be honest. Maybe dropping the points on a turtle a little bit. And small tweaks here and there. I would love to see the Isharan guard go down to the same points as the Morsar guard, because I just don't understand why they're more expensive. But other than that, when I played against you, Ryan, it did not feel unfair at all. The only thing that I really disliked about the way our units interacted was all tied to the morbid conjuration stuff.
Agreed.
But
I mean,
yeah, you have so many tricks, and none of them are a massive feel bad. Even the teleporting stuff felt cool and flavorful rather than feel bad. So yeah, I think they're gonna sit slap dap in the middle for a while, which is a good place to be.
yeah, I agree. You mentioned bring the Leviathan down. I think the number one target and the second best target is the Sharks, because they offer a lot of tech, but at 190, that's 20 points more than Morsar, and I have a
Yeah,
real hard time arguing to bring them when
that's
I
fair.
could just take King Morsar, even for the -1 to charge dice, which is really strong. And I would consider taking one, but I just wish it was closer to. It needs to be at least 170, I think, for me to consider it. But even then, I don't know. But anyway, impact on the meta, again, real hard to say. Thus far, maybe this is a good place to mention this. My 8 games thus far were against you with Lumineth, and I played Lumineth twice now. That would be your list, which was kind of a mixed build, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I played a Larith, largely a Larith Venari build, and had a really good time playing against that one with this list. They had a real hard time keeping up.
I was just gonna
Um,
say, man, that must have sucked for the Elorith player.
yeah. I mean, it was only his second game, but I
Yeah.
mean, it was a real fun game.
Yeah.
And then I've played, let's see, against Soulblight. That one was a narrow loss, and God, Soulblight, especially the Black Knights, real strong.
Yeah. Very good.
KO, the movement shenanigans are the only reason KO was really rough. It's just too much movement stuff that they're allowed to do. It's kind of weird and counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. I also played against Slanesh once. That was totally fine. Played against Stormcast. That was a close game. I'm trying to think what else I squeezed in
Zinch?
there. Got tabled by Zinch. Hugo's Zinch. His Zangor build was insane. I played it wrong, but I still think he would have tabled me. I mean, it just kicked my ass. And I don't remember if there was another game I'm missing in there. But in any case, it's been an interesting kind of delving into what the game looks like now. And honestly, all of my games have been long. Almost all of them have been close. And then furthermore, everyone's still learning the rules. So, it's hard to say what the meta is, but I have to say, and maybe this is shifting to closing thoughts. The reason I started with Idoneth this time was because it's who I started with last time. And I thought just out of tradition, and I even played against you that it was kind of for sentimental reasons that I wanted to do. That's how we started. But like I'm finding myself actually really enjoying playing the army again, and it's elite enough to not feel overwhelming bodies on table. There's a lot of movement shenanigans in tech, which I've always been a fan of.
Yeah.
I feel like list building is interesting. Every unit has an interesting role to play in the game, even the turtle, even the sharks, even the king, I think. And ultimately, it's scratching all of my Johnny side while also being a really great way to kind of like get started with a new edition. So I think it's a great time to be an Idoneth player and get out there and be creative. And maybe it'll end up getting hit with the same, like, has no place in the meta situation that it was last, 2/3 of third edition. But in any case, I'm still happy to be playing it and actually see a decent future for the army. So, what are you thinking for closing thoughts?
Yeah, very much the same thing. I just wanted to add that the fact that your battle formations have such a distinct bonus compared to the other battle formations, so everyone is very different. It also encourages you to build entirely different lists, right? Whereas with Lumineth, I mean, it's also still the case a little bit for Lumineth, but I do feel like their battle formations are less impactful. They're more like you build a list and then you choose a battle formation and not the other way around. So I think that encourages me to be, and that fully emphasizes your point of the fact that list building is so creative and freeing right now, because you have so many possibilities, and a full Namari list might not work as well in a different battle formation. So you might be inclined to add some different units to that to spice things up and change things around. So I think you can play a lot of different games and a lot of different army lists with this army before you feel like you've seen it all.
Definitely. So yeah, I'm probably going to be making some videos of covering the units in more detail, maybe some graphs of output and stuff, maybe some more comparisons like what you and Steve did while I'm on vacation, and that way we'll have some extra content out there for those of you that are curious. Let us know down below what you thought of this, right? I mean, if there's any particular comparisons you'd like to see, that'll help me know where to steer things too when I'm making those videos. Maybe let's go to that closing slide and wrap it up.
Shall I take us out here?
Yeah, right before you do, I just want to say, Jonas, thank you. It's been amazing lately, and to see that this is a coming full circle moment where you brought me on to Idoneth 2 years ago, and here we are again talking about it and having a great time and being positive about where all things are going. I just want to thank you for everything that you've done and for our friendship, and it's been amazing. So thanks for having me.
Well, likewise, all of that and more. And just to tie into that comment there with a thank you for you guys out there listening or watching our video, listening to our videos or watching our videos. This is, as Ryan mentioned, a little bit nostalgic for us because it's such a humble beginnings moment to where we are now. We're still very much a growing channel, but a couple of weeks ago we were celebrating our 3K subscribers, and now we're already 300 subscribers further along into that 4K, or almost to that 4K. So we've really picked up some pace. We're trying to put out as much quality content as we can, and we still try to differentiate from a lot of other great stuff that other fantastic YouTubers are already putting out there. So thank you guys so much for all of your support. We've seen some very positive feedback in the comments so far. The Discord is really overflowing with positivity as well the last couple of weeks. So thank you so much. And please continue leaving comments and leaving likes. It really encourages to make more content for you guys. And if you want to stay in touch for Ryan's potential War Scroll breakdown series, you can subscribe, or you can find us in the Discord to chat with us personally. Guys, thank you so much. Ryan, thank you so much for all the work that you put into the PowerPoint and into the presentation. And see you guys next time. Bye-bye.